I'm being bullied. I'm not even joking. I was all done with the Russian Navy series, which is why I released the supercut of all the parts together. And out of nowhere, one of my admins has been mercilessly bullying me just to make one more video in the series. And I'll be honest, I had some ideas for future videos in the series, but I stopped it because, well, I didn't want to just milk the Russian Navy dead because, well, I got bored. You can only talk about sadness so much before you get sick of it. So, instead of getting a video on the current Russian naval ooft in the Black Sea, yes, that video is actually coming. I'm doing it. It's called the Battle of the Black Sea, How Russia Lost the Naval War to a Country Without a Blue Water Navy. You're getting this video. You can thank Neha in my Discord. It's all her fault. Okay, not really. She did twist my arm a bit and has messaged me quite a bit about doing it, but I'm being a bit dramatic for effect here. Let's talk about another Soviet submarine though. A very late one, with quite possibly one of the saddest stories that just reeks of all the misery that was the very late Soviet Union, with all the hallmarks of stagnation. Let's talk about a submarine that perfectly encapsulates how and why the Soviet Union fell apart. Let's talk about K-278, Komsomolets, the sole Mike-class submarine with a tragic but classically Soviet and Russian ending. Like, comment, subscribe, and let's get into it. Komsomolets began her life in the Rubin Design Bureau as Project 685, as an attempt to leapfrog the Western powers with far more advanced nuclear-powered attack submarines that could carry a mixture of torpedoes and cruise missiles, with a nuclear option for the latter. Her keel was laid down in April 1978 at Severodonetsk as Hull K-278, being launched about 5 years later, in June 1983, joining the fleet that December. K-278 was a little different from other submarines, with a distinctive double hull, the inner hull being built from the very expensive titanium. This unique and very pricey and hard to build design, because titanium is a pain in the ass to work with, allowed the submarine to theoretically dive far deeper than its American counterparts. Given her ability to go this deep, the designers decided to include within the submarine 7 compartments, stronger forward and aft bulkheads, the idea being to create 2 sort of safety zones in case of emergencies in the second and third compartments, and also an escape capsule fitted within the submarine's fin above both of these compartments should anything go wrong. The idea of a submarine going so deep is actually really interesting. See, the purpose of it is that being able to go that deep, you'll be below thermal layers, and by being below these thermal layers, enemy submarines won't actually be able to hear you, so you can effectively just crawl along the bottom like a catfish and then pop up or shoot straight up into the enemy submarines and completely destroy them. It's a really, really intelligent idea. It was believed that the submarine was initially powered by 2 liquid-cooled reactors in the West, which caused a fair bit of panic at the possibility of this thing zipping around at depths in the Atlantic, like Lightning McQueen on meth, but it was later found out that it was just a single conventional Soviet reactor. It is possible. Now, it's possible, we don't entirely know this because the Russian archives and Soviet archives are completely shut and have been forever, because God forbid someone actually try and criticize the state with the actual evidence that the state has, that the Soviet Union wanted to put a better reactor or better propulsion system in the submarine. We don't actually know because, well, Soviet submarine. The submarine could potter along, therefore, at a very respectable, quick 26 to 30 knots underwater, which is pretty comparable to Western subs at the time, and up to about 14 knots on the surface. Again, pretty comparable. This swanky new metal tube also included some significant technical upgrades compared to older Soviet submarines, with many of the systems having the intention of being automated to reduce crew size and also cost. As such, the crew was as small as 64 men, with 30 officers, 22 warrant officers, and 12 petty officers, and enlisted. A very top-heavy command structure, but again, that's pretty standard for submarines. Unironically, the Hunt for Red October explains better than almost any historical source why Soviet submarines had very officer-heavy crews, but also very non-commissioned officer-heavy crews. It's very much based on politics, whereas, for example, a sonar operator would likely be an officer or a high-ranking non-commissioned officer in the Soviet Navy. It could be something simple like an enlisted man in the US Navy, and it really just comes down to different philosophies. K-278 was armed with the usual 6 tubes, sporting the aforementioned missiles and torpedo armament. In all, the submarine was 117.5 metres long, 10.7 metres wide, and had a draft of up to 9 metres, clocking in between 5,000-ish tonnes on the surface and about 8,000 submerged. Now all the techie boring stuff is out of the way, well, sort of, there will be some more later when we get into the misery. We can all get into the absolute horror that is yet another episode of the late Soviet Union at sea. Now you might be asking just quickly, what is a Komsomolets? Well, it means a member of the Komsomol. So what is a Komsomol, you may ask, in a slightly more annoyed and passive-aggressive tone, while crossing your arms? Well, Komsomol's full English title was the All-Union Leninist Young Communist League, effectively a youth organisation for the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In its earliest form, this little Lenin youth was founded in 1918 as the Russian Young Communist League, and would later be spread amongst the entire USSR. The Komsomol was actually the final of 3 organisations a good party member and proper little communist would theoretically join before actually joining the proper party. In order, they were the Little Octoberists, the Young Pioneers, and lastly, the Komsomol. The idea being that these organisations would ensure that above all you behave and that you become what the state wants you to, and you find your purpose within the party and the state. These days, there is a spiritual successor to the organisation called the Movement of the First, which was created 2022 by Putin to teach the youth a worldview based on traditional Russian spiritual and moral values and goals. You know, like drinking heavily and beating women, mass murder, kidnapping children and stuff. Traditional, modern Russian values in the modern state. But I digress, let's get back to the submarine. The submarine would be sent out on a 3rd combat patrol in April 1989 under the command of Evgeny Vanin. The submarine was patrolling a region of the Barents Sea, effectively the Soviet backyard, not too far away from Norway's Bear Island, just a few days sailing from their home port. The submarine was running deep during this patrol, and on the 7th, a fire broke out within one of the boat's engineering compartments. It is likely that the wiring was the culprit. At least that is the official story, and there's no real reason to disbelieve it, because the submarine suffered in construction from the ongoing material shortages, and because of this, the work done wasn't done to the best standard. It appears that what happened was that the pressure of being submerged, as it was designed to do, caused a hot oil leak, which sprayed onto the submarine's electrics that could not be isolated within compartments. The oil, effectively spraying out of the engines and out of the compartments, was sprayed directly onto the wiring, which itself was not protected correctly from things like, hot stuff, like fire. The fire continued to rage on, and it could not be isolated within those special compartments. The crew slammed shut the watertight doors as fast as possible, but it did nothing to stop the fire, which kept spreading through the boat's cables. The cables not having a way to be isolated compartment to compartment and connecting throughout the entire boat. The reactor was quickly scrammed to avoid, it detonating during a giant fire, and the boat lost propulsion. This all reportedly occurred really, really quickly, and there was really nothing the crew could have done. They did everything perfectly here. With their options exhausted, no propulsion, no way to move the submarine at all, the hull filling with flames and smoke, the crew tried to evacuate, blowing the ballast tanks and trying to get to the surface. The officers sent out distress signals, while the men were ordered to abandon the boat. The compressed air system aboard the submarine, though, made matters worse here, with the oxygen mixture being far too rich and just feeding the flames with effectively fuel, gutting the inside of the boat's vital compartments. The fire would continue burning until about 3 p.m-ish local time, where the boat would begin to sink in about 1,600 metres of water, around 250 kilometres from the Norwegian coast. Captain Vanin and 4 others meanwhile stayed aboard, desperately trying to get help for the crew who had abandoned the boat, again doing everything right. And it seems that they were caught by surprise when the submarine finally went down. The 5 men rushed to the escape pod, which failed to work correctly and flooded, killing 4 of the 5 men, including Captain Bannon. Again, just another case of rushed construction without thought given to it doing its job properly and costing lives. The efforts of the captain did pay off though, and his sacrifice wasn't for nothing because the rescue aircraft arrived quickly, dropping rafts, but the reality was that the sea was horrifically rough, and the conditions meant that their use was impossible. On top of that, the ocean temperature was only 2 degrees, which to put it in perspective, is a similar temperature to the water the night the Titanic sank. 81 minutes after the sinking, the floating fish factory, Alexei Klobotstov, arrived, but like with the Titanic, it was just too late, and many of the crew had died from hypothermia. Of the 69 crew on the Komsomolets at the time of sinking, 42 would die, 30 of those from the cold water. But why did the K-278 go to the bottom? That isn't a silly question, and no, I'm not just referring to the fire. Yes, obviously that sank it, and generally speaking, floaty things sink when water gets in them. Yes. But the sinking of the K-278 is at its core the ultimate metaphor for the dying USSR and the corpse that the Russian Federation now inhabits. Now, I've been through the misery party that was the Soviet Union in the 1980s before, but it really applies here, and it is really important to know. See, the USSR was a top-down bureaucracy, with the state being centered around the powerful General Secretary and wider Politburo. This is all a fancy way of saying it's a dictatorship with extra steps. Nominally, the General Secretary only controlled the Communist Party directly, but given that the Soviet Union was a one-party state, well, go figure. In order to maintain this control, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, yes, that's the actual title, and the Politburo relied on a series of councils, with each industry having its own councils and a series of deputy directors running top-down. You can really see this within the ministries of atomic energy, but also within the ministries of defense, with powers centered around powerful ministers in Moscow and series of less powerful ministers under progressively less powerful ministers until you reach individual nuclear power plants, bases, or dockyards. Think of this as a giant Marxist pyramid scheme with more sadness and less Tupperware. The Atomic Energy Department really explains these problems the best, and it's also the most well known and least hidden within the archives that we can no longer access, so I'm going to use it as an example here. Within each power plant, there would be a series of similar positions and ministers and directors until you reach the plant staff itself, and within that staff itself it would continue. The Chernobyl disaster would later highlight just how ineffective this structure could be, but it would also highlight, and this is something that defense really highlights as well with things like the Kursk, the ability for scapegoating when something goes wrong, ultimately protecting those at the top, namely the Politburo, the General Secretary, and by proxy, the integrity of the state itself as a force for quote-unquote good. Further to this, these progressive deputy directors and secretaries were unelected and put into place by people in more powerful positions. This kind of structure allowed the Soviet Union to survive scandals caused by avoidable accidents, because it protected the integrity of the state and saved its face. The goal of the Soviet state, and the reason for this kind of government structure, was the theory of the collective state's goal. An example throughout Soviet history is the 5-year plans, and the centralization of the state's resources for what was deemed to be the collective good, which in reality made the country stronger, so it made the government stronger, so it's a vicious cycle. This rigid government structure would absolutely destroy the Soviet Union during the Brezhnev era, with the Soviet economy being unable to provide, and because it was all collectivized, and it was all relying on itself to feed the state, we now enter the era of stagnation. And there's not really any way to come back from this. And this is where the pain really begins. The consequences of the era of stagnation and the Soviet political structure came to fruition both with the Komsomolets, but again, using Chernobyl as an example, with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986, just a couple years before our submarine goes down. The destruction of the plant and the sheer scale of the disaster was hidden from the public and the world, including the nearby town of Pripyat, just like the disasters in the Navy were hidden from the people. Just like the Kursk would later be attempted to be hidden from the people. The cause of the actual explosion that destroyed the plant, obviously being that hidden fault within the reactor, that was hidden specifically to protect the state, because it was too expensive to replace it. Sounding familiar? This whole disaster, Chernobyl, and, well, the Komsomolets, it's violently late Soviet. But it's all made worse. See, all these lies could theoretically be made okay if the builders actually had the resources to build the things they're being told to build. The workers could not actually build the products they were told to build. The plant director Brukhanov in Chernobyl was actually given the order to build the plant within an allotted time frame and to provide a certain level of power to the grid, just like the builders of the Komsomolets were told, build submarine that goes deep and really deep and deeper than American submarine. Brukhanov's way around this was, well, I need to build the plants, I need to build 4 reactors by this date, and then I need to build 2 more after that, so what I'll do is I'll combine reactors 3 and 4 into one building. Bad idea, for one, in order to save money, and because I can't actually put gravel and other things on the roof to seal the roof, I will cover it in tar. Highly flammable tar. The Soviet government does not care as long as the work is done because, oh, look, we've built the reactor, we've done what we need to do, it's done. Go Soviet Union. And it's the same thing with the submarine. We've built the submarine. It doesn't matter that the wiring is not contained and all fire is able to be put out if it starts in the wiring. It doesn't matter that it's not covered properly. It dives, it's a submarine, it does what it wants and does what we need it to do. Now you may be asking, Ho, this is supposed to be a video about a Soviet submarine. Why the hell are you talking about Chernobyl so much? Well, like I said, it's because it's the ultimate allegory for the state of the Soviet Union during this period. See, the atomic energy department was the funded part of Soviet infrastructure, just like the defense spending. This was the funded part. In terms of defense, the issues at Chernobyl were so clearly there, and in some cases much worse. The K-278, like I've been saying, went through all these pains, and we can see it so clearly in the boat's construction. As the Soviet Union fell apart and the economy broke down, the order to build a highly complex titanium submarine would require special care, and funding would need to be provided to each part of the submarine. The wiring suffered here from the era of stagnation, and shortcuts were made to get the boat into service. One of these shortcuts, like I've been saying, meant that the submarine could not isolate her compartments if a fire occurred, because the fire can always find a way. Fire will always find a way. It's like water. It will find a path. The submarine's demand to dive extremely deeply meant that her ballast system was under immense pressure too, and because this was the first submarine of the type and money simply wasn't there for extensive testing, a sort of alright, let's just do it approach was taken. And yeah, this approach worked twice for the first 2 patrols, but the reality was that the boat was a time bomb, because the moment the fire started, you had an oxygen system pumping oxygen onto a fire. The care and attention simply was not shown to the construction of the boat. This is a lesson that was learnt the hard way by the United States after the Thresher and the Scorpion. Simply put, the Soviets just could not do it, not in the late 1980s, not doing something that they should have been doing since the 60s but were so obsessed with saving face and catching up that they ignored it. The Komsomolets was an awesome concept, a sub that could dive deeper and harder than any other, but she was built on a shoestring budget by workers experiencing the very worst of the era of stagnation. So why did she sink? Well, yeah, the fire did it, but she went down because she was a Wunderwaffen built by a dying regime. Would you believe that regime also planned the Kursk? The sinking of the submarine should have been the end of this horrific story, a full stop on the horrific nature of the cost of stagnation, a disaster that had it occurred at any other point in history would have made headlines. But the danger was far from over, because the K-278 went down with 2 nuclear torpedoes, and 8 others, mind you. The Norwegians were not at all pleased at the fact there were 2 nukes sitting on the bottom of the ocean right next to their territory, and under pressure from the Norwegians and still trying to get a little goodwill, the Soviets sent a research ship, the Keldysh, to search for the wreck. I guarantee you actually know the Keldysh, because it's the research ship from the movie Titanic. I kid you not, small world, right? In June 1989, the wreck was located, some 2 months after its sinking, but in typical Soviet fashion they turned around and said any leak was merely insignificant, and posed no threat to the environment. Naturally, given Chernobyl had just done its best Hiroshima impression, nobody really trusted a word the Soviet government had to say. But it did appear that the weapons were intact and not causing issues to marine life. And so the sub stayed on the bottom, rusting away as the Red Banner came down for the last time in December 1991, and the Russian High Command, who claims to be the one true successor state of the Soviet Union, hence why this is under the name Russian Navy Sucks, continued to pretend the submarine was not a problem, even while the Kursk went and blew up. In 1993, meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chernobyl pushed against the grain and founded the Komsomolets Nuclear Submarine Memorial Society to help provide for the widows and orphans of the lost boat. The society would later have to be expanded in order to help all lost Soviet and Russian submariner families. That's a significant number of sailors. In 1994, Russians actually went and examined the wreck again, only to find that the plutonium was now leaking into the sea through fractures in the hull caused from her impact on the ocean floor. On the 24th of June 1995, the Keldysh was again tasked to sail to the wreck, this time to seal the fractures and entomb the radioactive waste in the forward torpedo compartment to finally stop the leaking. The work done by the Keldysh meant that the radioactive material would remain locked inside the boat until the mid to early 2020s, at which time more work would need to be done, or the torpedoes would need to be removed lest they poison the ocean. Ever since news about the disaster broke, the Norwegians have actually kept a really close eye on the wreck, sending teams annually to examine the water and ocean bed to ensure that the environment is not killed by, well, leaking plutonium torpedoes. In 2019, a joint Russian-Norwegian team found that together that the work undertaken by the crew of the Keldysh was failing, and that radioactive material was beginning to seep through into the sea. Nowhere near to dangerous levels yet, but it was increasing. As we currently stand, the Russian government has made no effort when it comes to fixing this problem, seemingly happy to just ignore it and leave it on the bottom of the ocean, knowing full well the West will just pay to fix the problem, and this isn't the first time. Western donors have had to pay Russia before to actually get rid of nuclear waste to stop the environment from being poisoned and turn uninhabitable. Given that the Russian government right now is obsessed with saving face and has turned into such a sad state that it relies on ammunition from North Korea and Iran, it is unlikely they will care to do it. But that is the tale of the Komsomolets. It isn't comical, it isn't fun, it's sad and horrific, and yet it is the perfect encapsulation of why the Soviet Union fell apart, and how that culture and thought process carried forward into the modern Navy. And this is why, and say it with me folks, the Russian Navy sucks. I really wasn't going to do any more videos on the Russian Navy, but to be honest, I have been prodded constantly by my mod team and friend to make this thing. This, along with her reels of just the most horrific Midwestern cooking in which mayonnaise is deemed spicy, meant that I either had a choice to watch them or just hurry up and make the video lest I be tortured to death. But either way, I hope you enjoyed it. Consider this the beginning of Season 2 of the Russian Navy. Yeah, that's right, I didn't stutter.
I've told you all about the horrible history of the Russian Navy. Many times. We've talked about the horrible history of the Russian Navy over and over again, the Soviet Navy too. But enough about the horrible history, let's talk about their horrible future. And to start with, I'm going to take some inspiration from my friend Laserpick here on a video that he did where he started with a bit of a story about an online persona. And I'm going to tell you my little story of probably the most interesting person I've interacted with online that I think perfectly encapsulates today's topic and really, well, the modern Russian Navy. In the beginning, there was nothing. Then there was something. The particulars in which this occurred do cause some contention, with the culprit of humanity either being a rainbow snake or the big G. There are a few others in between, but they're the two that come to mind straight away. Really take your own choice on how we all got here. Either way, humans appeared, we built empires, and we evolved to become the only known species in the universe, so far, that were able to leave our own planets and go explore the stars. And then one day, a man we will call Redmin was born. Redmin was from one of the spicy countries in the Balkans that split out of Yugoslavia with his family moving to Northern Europe during the period where Serbia achieved the one thing they have been proud of in the modern era, when they whiffed and shot down an F-117. Okay, that's a bit harsh. The people in Serbia are actually seeming to wake up a little and stop being useful idiots for Moscow, at least those who took to the streets in Belgrade, so there's hope there. Anyway, Redmin was somebody who presented himself as a strong man, somebody mysterious, someone showing strength and power. Real man. He believed his own propaganda that he was somebody who was better, smarter, and more suited to leadership than others. But for some reason, people in his life just didn't see it that way. So he went online, to Facebook, where he made a page dedicated to memes about one of the large European empires from ancient times. Redmin would then create a group of his fans together, a guard of sorts, and they would play games, chat about politics, and really just enjoy themselves. I was one of these original people, back when I was 18 and more interested in what the girls at university were up to than actually doing my uni coursework. I'd go home, well, to my uni res, I'd log on, I'd have fun with my friends, and then I'd switch off and go to a party. But Redmin couldn't switch off, because for the first time in his life, people were listening to him. Redmin would further raise the stakes and start to roleplay as an emperor, adopting, allegedly, but I'm pretty sure it was a LARP at first, a religion that he definitely was not, or at least he wasn't acting like. Alas, one day Redmin would appoint a patriarch of sorts to enforce this religion on the group, and slowly the group became more and more extreme. Certain people started to leave, new ones came in. Skin colour and race mixing became the topic instead of things like history and Crusader Kings too. You can guess the context to those conversations. Then one day he introduced the first of two girlfriends, and demanded that she be worshipped as an empress, giving her a name and a title. Everyone kinda had enough. There was a great schism, many of us leaving, but the path would get worse. Those who replaced the old people became yes-men to Redmin, more racist, more vicious, and zealotry became the order of the day. This continued for a time, most of us original members walking away from it all, starting lives, getting married, having children, but sometimes we'd check back in and see what was going on. Redmin would eventually become so extreme that his new beliefs, gassed up by his followers as yes-men, got him kicked out of university. He lost his friends, his girlfriend, he was alone. It turns out that big strong guy was just a shell pretending he was something he wasn't. This happens a lot more than you realise in history, and it's not just people. It's states, it's organisations too. Sometimes what you see on the surface is just that. It's a surface. And the Russian Navy now has its very own Redmin, the Admiral Nakhimov. Okay, so I had this planned for December, but as per usual, being a dad at Christmas time means that you have less time than you think you do to actually do things. So instead of sitting down in a dark room with a mug of brown happy juice from the Scottish Highlands, I've been attending kindergarten stage shows with a horde of 6-year-olds singing Feliz Navidad and horribly wrapping Christmas presents myself. I'm sure none of you will complain though, because while this has been going on, I've discovered this new Russian Wunderwaffe. We are going on a journey today, ladies, gentlemen, and the Technicolor rainbow in between. But before we roll the music, don't bother trying to Google Redmin. The story is real, but the name and details have been changed. I'm very happy to say that he's doing a lot better now, and is back in reality, not being led around by extremism, and is much happier for it, at least last when I checked, and he has met someone who's very nice and brings out the best in him. That story has a happy ending. This is the last happy ending you're getting for this video. Okay, so now I know what you're saying. We've spoken about the Admiral Nakhimov before, and you're right, yes, we have, but that was a different Admiral Nakhimov. The old Nakhimov was a clapped-out, YouTube-friendly term spicy pinwheel era ocean liner taken over by the Soviets that was rammed by a container ship and sank into the Black Sea. The new one, well, it's very, very old. A monument to the past, if you will, that is being forced into a 21st century shell because Russia can't afford to do any better, and believe me, they are trying. It's time, though, to go back in time to where this tale started. We are headed back to the USSR. This would be a great time to use the Beatles music, but, copyright might get me a little bit. The year is 1974, and on the slipway at the Baltivsky Zavod shipyards in Leningrad, a giant metal monster is under construction. On paper, it looks incredible, the ultimate tool that can destroy NATO's hegemony at sea, smashing through a carrier group's escort with its SSN-19 shipwreck missiles, and then steaming away at 13 knots using its nuclear reactor to keep up its speed, while the smelly Western capitalist diesel engines can't keep up. These ships cause quite a panic in the Western media, with the big scary title of battlecruiser heaped on them. At a glance, you can see why the media called them this. The Kirovs were over twice the displacement of the American Virginia-class nuclear cruisers, but a battlecruiser? Not really. Large heavy cruisers, sure, but not a battlecruiser. It's just a fancy way of making it sound bigger and stronger than it actually is. Think calling the Kiev an aircraft carrier where in reality it's a floating missile cruiser with some planes on it. See, under the facade of imposing doom, the Kirovs were naturally suffering from the good old curse that was the late Soviet Union. Their missiles, the shipwrecks, with the cool name like the Checkmate and the Felon, well, there were only 20 of them per ship. And the 4 ships were spread out across the entire USSR, which was big. They cost a fortune to build, let alone maintain, which, it's the late Soviet Union, who cares about that? Their crew size was huge, over 710 men a pop. The dockyard space needed to maintain them. Again, it's the late USSR. What's the maintenance? And just to give you an idea of what kind of state the ship was in, the main missiles, the shipwrecks, they were designed for submarines. To actually use them, the Kirovs have to partially submerge their missile tubes to fire, which takes a lot of time and looks very stupid. Never mind attempting to modify the missiles to work with the ship. No, see, that costs money. Not to mention the introduction of Aegis and the fact that this behemoth of a ship could fire 20 missiles and would have to be launched against a carrier group that was well within range and able to hit back with its planes, defended by the Ticonderoga class. Yeah, it wasn't ever going to work. The Kirovs were giant white elephants. They were never ever going to work. In fact, if you play the game Sea Power, they have been buffed beyond belief and the US forces have been nerfed to give them a chance. The Kirovs were just simply put, were built in a time and place where they could not be maintained, they could not be supported, and their role was really not existent anymore after the US caught up with Aegis. But anyway, as 1990 rolled around and the Red Banner came down, Russia, the inheritor of these 4 behemoth cruisers, Russia, where the people were surviving on pickled spinach, was now left to pick up the pieces and keep up the lie, and to build a new navy. When the Soviet Union fell, the Red Fleet was split amongst the former states. At least it was supposed to be. In reality, the USSR, being a Russian empire in a trench coat, dominated the high command with ethnic Russians, and using the Kuznetsov as an example, yes, the carrier, that was supposed to go to Ukraine because it was built in Ukraine, being outfitted in Ukraine and was owned by Ukraine at the time, was stolen by its Russian officer corps and sailed at full speed to Murmansk after dropping half the crew on the jetty. The only problem with Russia yoinking most of the fleet was that it could simply not afford it. Very quickly it found that the Kirovs were just slightly too damn expensive to dream about keeping in service. So in 1999, Kalinin was mothballed under the new name Admiral Nakhimov. The Kirov was now called the Admiral Ushakov, the Admiral Lazarev was the ex-Fruns, and it followed suit in 1999. Only the Yuri Andropov, aka the Peter Veliki, or Peter the Great, funnily enough the person that Putin tries to model himself after and claims that he worships above anyone, was kept in service. Lazarev, Ushakov and Nakhimov were all put into bays and left to rot, under the assumption that they could be returned back to service when they were needed. In a way, there was a general idea that when the Peter Veliki was worn out beyond repair, the other 3 could be subbed in and out as super mega powerful capital ships. Then they could, keep up the facade and Russia would always have this big mega strong flagship. That kind of thing. See, the Russian High Command realised that it was impossible for the Kuznetsov to fill the role of flagship for the new Russia, at least the physical flagship. On paper she can get called the flagship, but something about a giant black soot belching highly flammable piece of crap doesn't exactly give the idea and vibe of the power that the new 2000s Putin Russia wanted to show off. But a nuclear-powered battlecruiser that could wipe out a US carrier group, now that's some propaganda you could work with. The problem of keeping the Peter the Great or the Peter Veliki in service could be sort of solved in the short term by using the Ushakov or the ex-Kirov for parts. See, back in the 90s when the ship was new, it kind of had a bit of a Soviet nuclear reactor moment. And she'd been acting as a parts mule for the other 3 ships since anyway, so it kinda worked. But eventually, the Pyotr Veliky would run into the issue of overuse and inoperability. As the 2000s continued on, the Russians realised that the Veliky was on its way out and it needed replacing. Of course, the idea was to eventually replace the ships with a new large class of destroyer, but that is something we'll get to in a little bit. But in the short term, the Soviets went and looked at the Lazarev and inspected it, going, alright, we'll use this ship to replace the Veliky, looking to return the ship to service and refit it into a state where it could one-for-one replace it. But as it turns out, abandoning a ship in Siberian bays for over a decade and not bothering to maintain them does not constitute a happy return to service. The Russian High Command made the choice here to scrap the ship, and as of October 2022, the absolutely clapped out and broken Admiral Lazarev has been slowly broken apart. It looks like it is still being scrapped as we speak, although news is a bit hazy on that one. Turning to the other white elephant, the Nakhimov was then chosen to be the new old toy. And that's where our tale sort of really begins, because this refit technically begins in 2015. And it's still ongoing as of the 1st of the 1st, 2025. Speaking of, haven't given you a new video all year, so sorry guys. I had to get my one dad joke in, sue me. Nakhimov's refit officially began in 2015, but unofficially the ship has been in a state of needing and receiving intermittent repairs since 1997 to stay afloat and be able to return to service on supposedly short notice. In reality, the ship has been unable to leave port since it was decommissioned. According to TASS, yes, the Russian news media source, aka the propaganda sludge pipe that certain Twitter-loving blue checkmarks deep-throat as real free-thinker facts, the ship was supposed to be in refit for 5 years from 2015 to 2020, at which point she was supposed to be taken out to sea under her own power and rejoin the fleet to replace the Pyotr Veliky as the flagship of the Russian Navy, or to operate side by side. This quickly was pushed back to 2021, then 2022, then 2023, then November 2024. It is now the 1st of the 1st, 2025, and we still do not have a date. Are you sensing a pattern here? The thing can't leave port yet under its own power. The purpose of this refit, again according to Russian media, is to replace and upgrade the vessel's systems, but in particular its weaponry, to include the super mega powerful uber weapon Zircon. That is apparently a hypersonic missile that nothing can ever intercept. At least that's what Twitter tells me, and as Elon Muskovich says, Twitter is the real source for true journalism and facts. It is suspected that the Veliky can't actually sail for periods of time, other than simple showing the flag cruisers due to a lack of infrastructure at its home port and a lack of upgrades during the last 2 decades. Very similar to how the Kuznetsov is suffering from the fact that every time it ties up to the jetty, it has to power the whole jetty. It can't just be, plugged in to the power grid, like, for example, an American aircraft carrier can, or any other ship from any other navy that knows how to maintain them. So with the Veliky on its last legs, the Kuznetsov in pieces and unable to move, and probably never moving again, the lack of a major surface combatant has left the northern fleets of the Russian Navy incredibly weak. So weak that if the US Navy decided to just not bother to go to Europe and the Royal Navy decided to go on a holiday to the Caribbean, the French Navy alone could probably body everything that Russia has that can actually sail in the region. The lack of a replacement for the Veliky certainly is a real problem, and it's spurring on desperation to get the Nakhimov back into service, ignoring the fact that its weapons can and have regularly been intercepted by the weapons the West possessed decades ago, as has been highlighted in Ukraine. Some Russian news media sources have questioned the reason for the delay, but there really aren't any answers. It's just delay, delay, and delay. But that begs the question, why refit a ship that is nearly 4 decades old? There really isn't a definitive answer here, and we won't know for sure unless the Russian state develops any kind of transparency, which, not likely. But we can wager a guess based on what we know. And it has something to do with the fact that the Navy is struggling to replace anything from the Soviet Union, because the Russian military-industrial complex, well, if you think America's ruled by one, oh boy, it's time to talk about the Russian one, which is, it's certainly a vibe. You will all know that after the Soviet Union, as I said before, Russia inherited or stole most of the USSR's navy, centering their new fleet around the carrier Kuznetsov, the 4 Kirovs, and other large cruisers of the Kara and Slava class. There were destroyers such as the Udaloys and Sovremenis as the backbone as well, and of course the submarines. This was absolutely fine in the 90s and left Russia in a very powerful position at sea. The Slavas and the Kirovs were new, so were the Sovremenis and the Udaloys, relatively speaking, and so was the Kuznetsov. The Karas, though, well, they were very, very old, as were some of the other ships that they inherited, such as the Grishas. The destroyers were a little older, but this was 1991, over 30 years ago now. These ships, even though they were a few years old, were absolutely fine. They were strong. The Russian fleet, the Russian bear, was threatening. But the cracks first started showing with the Kuznetsov, with the new Russia being unable to afford to keep the thing running or build anything to fix it when it broke. But it wasn't just the Kuznetsov, because as we saw earlier, the Kirovs were mostly retired as fast as possible, just keeping just one in service. The submarines suffered most of the same fate, laid up in port with crews just big enough to maintain them, so that they looked on paper as part of the fleet, something that would have disastrous consequences when the Kursk exploded just a few years later. The Russian High Command, to their credit, actually realised in the early 2000s that this way of doing things really would not work in the next 10 to 20 years, and that replacements would need to be made. Now, in the short term, the idea was, like I said, the Kirovs could be swapped out, but there would need to be a new flat top to replace the Kuznetsov. Russia couldn't just build one, but they designed one during the Soviet Union called the Ural, and they were getting to around building it, so that was a plan they could base the Storm on, which is a new-fangled, dangly designed Russian aircraft carrier. Slight issue with that, the only place they could build it is Mykolaiv in Ukraine, and Ukraine's not exactly going to build them an aircraft carrier, let alone now. But as a stopgap, they went to Europe and went shopping for assault carriers / helicopter carriers, something that was very fashionable at the time, mind you. This is the mid-2000s to late 2000s, early 2010s. See, France and Spain were in the middle of attempting to woo Australia to buy the Mistral class or the Juan Carlos class to replace the old Australian assault ships. Eventually, Australia went out and picked the Spanish design, becoming HMAS Canberra and HMAS Adelaide. Turkey has since picked this design as well and is building its own variant of the class. But the French, feeling a bit sore, were still, wanting to sell some ships. They built 3 Mistrals for themselves, but they managed to sell 2 to Russia. The idea was that these ships would be built in France and then sold on and given to Russia. They would be accepted into service. One would join the Black Sea Fleet, and the other was either going to the Pacific Fleet or the Northern Fleet, but Russia would have flat tops again. On the flip side, the Navy started an ambitious building program of small, heavily armed corvettes, something that could really buff up the numbers and still put up a fight, and complete the tasks, patrolling the waters, gunboat diplomacy, the kind of things that, your dictatorial state needs you to do. And after all, at the time, they're really only fighting Georgia. When I say fighting, they are bullying Georgia because Georgia dares to not want to be part of Russia, and, doing horrific things in Chechnya. Joining these new small ships was a set of new frigates built with the help of Indian money, as the Indian Navy had paid exorbitantly for the refitted Baku, aka the Vikramaditya, a carrier. Indian money would further fund Russian naval resurgence, paying for the replacement of more old frigates and destroyers, with new ships built for both Russia but also for India. By 2012, everything was looking a bit up, at least for the surface fleet. In 2014, it was planned that the old Kara-class cruisers and some of the old corvettes and frigates would all be replaced by newer, more powerful ships. And on its way too was the new submarine Belgorod, which could carry that, psycho nuclear torpedo that could, throw cobalt everywhere and make places uninhabitable, according to Twitter. Yeah, that was a thing. And then we come to the old Kirovs, the Slavas and the destroyers, all now so long in the tooth that most couldn't sail, and if they could, their states were such that if an American equivalent was inspected and found in that position, their captains would be imprisoned. Take evidence from the Moskva. The Ukrainians should not have been able to destroy it with 2 missiles, yet they did. The grand plan was to replace these ships, the Udaloys, the Sovremenis, the Kirovs, and the Slavas, with one class of 12 large destroyers, basically cruisers. The Leader class, or Lighter class, aka Project 23560. The Leaders would replace all of the cruisers and destroyers. They would be nuclear powered and be comparable in size to the Kirovs, shorter by about only 20 meters and a bit less in displacement. They would be armed with the Onyx, Caliber, and Zircon. The exact same armaments the Nakhimov is currently being refitted with, but keep that in mind. These new ships would lead fleets, hunt in packs, and form the core of the new Russian Navy, with the assault carriers and the frigates being able to go straight at these new formations of Royal Navy carrier groups, the French carrier groups. And the idea was that, like the old times, they could use their powerful missiles as a pack to overwhelm NATO carrier battle groups. The design was an evolution of previous cruiser and destroyer designs that was finalised roughly in the mid-2010s, but they had been in the works for many years prior. On the surface, everything was coming up Russia. Everything looked good. New surface ships, new subs, new designs, and I'll be honest, these ships look pretty damn cool, not gonna lie. And it looks scary. The Royal Navy was a bit spooked from all their budget cuts under the, successive governments that they replaced their carriers with two large carriers, the Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales. The French looked at and they're commissioning a new super carrier in the coming years. Brand new destroyers, new frigates. All of these new ships were being laid down by Europe. Super cruisers, basically, by Germany that look terrifying on paper, are all being laid down because this is what they were expecting. They were expecting a very powerful modern Russian fleet. And then 2014 happened. And this is where the cracks became cavernous, even to those who weren't looking for them. When Russia invaded Ukraine, and yes, it invaded Ukraine in 2014, it wasn't rebels who somehow found heavy weapons and rose up. No. It was the Russian military and the Russian state that invaded Ukraine because, well, Ukraine dared to say no to being a slave to its bigger neighbour. When Russia did this, it was the biggest fumble in naval shipbuilding since the scale of Plan Z's failure in 1939. The French, having absolutely none of it when Russia crossed the border into Crimea, cancelled the contract for the two Mistrals, which were, mind you, effectively completed and waiting for delivery in port. They were instead sold to Egypt a couple of years later. Russia chucked a hissy fit, then they were told, right, leave Ukraine, you get the ships, and they went, no, we're not in Ukraine. And then France turned around and went, well, don't get the ships then, stop lying. And then Russia turned around and said, oh, well, we'll build our own then. Get to those. The imports for the new frigates' sensors and power plants dried up, slowing construction. Interestingly enough, parts of these new frigates' engines actually, for some of them, came from, of all places, Ukraine. The Belgorod was again delayed. Laid down in the 90s, designed as a sister to the Kursk, which itself was designed in the 70s. The boat would now not enter service until 2022. Any chance of the Kuznetsov's replacement actually being laid down disappeared, and that's before we even get to the Kirov's replacement. The leaders, all 12 planned, were now so far beyond reach that it wasn't funny. So instead, desperate to keep up appearances, the Navy looked to the Nakhimov, being held together already by hopes and dreams, and sent her in for a refit that, interestingly, would outfit her exactly as if she was a leader. A shell pretending to be something she was not. A Redmin, if you will. But things haven't got any better for the Russian naval part of their MIC because, as the war in Ukraine has evolved into a full-scale invasion, and /G word that I can't say, the Navy came to realise that making these large ships was impossible. Two of them were supposed to be in the water by 2028, but now the Navy has to resort to small corvettes and occasionally what they called super frigate, called the Gorshkov class. The Gorshkovs are barely 2/3 of the size of the new Type 26 class frigates being built in Scotland for the Royal Navy, just to give you some context. This is before we even get to the fact that the supplies are going missing from these shipyards, fuel is being sold for machines, and important parts are just not making it into Russia with the sanctions. These ships are not being built. It's not happening. It's gotten so bad that the Russian Navy can't even get the Nakhimov to sail under its own reactor, after a decade and $1 trillion rubles spent on it in refit. There is a certain poeticness to the fact that Admiral Nakhimov, the real man, was the example of the shining light that was a powerful and highly professional Russian Navy, for all of about 5 minutes until he died. It is poetic that his namesake should be the greatest example of what the modern Russian Navy and state has become. So what will we see in future from the Russian Navy? Will we see the new modern yet smaller potent fleet? No, we will not. Russia has lost the naval war in the Black Sea so badly it hides in port, barely daring to leave. Its flagship sits on the bottom, designated a Ukrainian cultural heritage site in the Black Sea, and even its new corvettes sit alongside it as artificial reefs. There will be no new carrier. The Mistral-class assault carriers will never come, sold to Egypt instead. The Project 23900, a Soviet-designed rushed into construction to replace the Mistrals, will never be finished. After 10 years they sit in pieces on the slipways. For comparison's sake, the HMAS Canberra, Australia's flagship, was laid down in 2009 and commissioned in 2014. It doesn't take 10 years to build an assault carrier. The new frigates are mostly now being built to be exported to raise capital, with the most recent one being delivered to the Indian Navy. The new submarines, if you can call them new, are delayed, and now well and truly outnumbered by their American and French and British counterparts. Not to mention the fact that most of the new submarines being laid down are the old Kilo designs, which are Cold War vintage in themselves. And the Nakhimov? Well, she joins a fleet on its knees. Its crew is being sent as ground forces into the Ukrainian front lines, and that's if she can get commissioned back into the fleet, with the odds looking less and less likely, not even considering what passes as a ship that is able to be commissioned into the Russian Navy in 2025. But hey, it's the Russian Navy. It can always get worse. And when it does, I'm right here, and you'll hear about it. Thank you all for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas to all of you, or happy whatever holidays, whichever one you celebrate. We're all a bit different, who knows. A little tidbit before we end. I greatly appreciate all the things sent to the PO box. Mostly, the giant purple floppy thing that's in the shape of a man's appendage. I didn't need that. Don't know who did it, did not need it, would still like to know who did it, and question you because you spent a lot of money on something that is, well, it doesn't do much. It just sort of flops around. But anyway. Now, honestly, I feel a bit like a princess being spoilt from all the models that have shown up, but please, please, please be a bit more creative than sending me horrific model kits from Trumpeter of Soviet warships. I get the meme, it's funny. I have the Moskva in 1/350 scale. I've built it. It's sitting on my desk above me. I'm going to turn it into a diorama with a lot of blue and yellow on it, and I'm going to have the famous line from Snake Island sprayed onto the diorama base in the colours of the Ukrainian flag. It's going to be something nice. I have a 1/350 scale Kuznetsov that I could probably put a baby in to sleep in. It's so big, I could use it as a crib. I don't need more Soviet ships. Please. They don't need friends. They really don't need friends. There's only like 2 or 3 other in that scale that I can think of, and I really don't need them. I appreciate you all, but I don't need them. But anyway, Happy New Year. Here's to 100,000 subs in 2025. I have created an Amazon wishlist of basically the books that I use to research upcoming videos, such as the history of Belarus, and yes, I'm working on something very long about the Kuznetsov. Side note, the giant Kuznetsov on that list is there as a meme. It is a meme. I say again, it's a meme. Do not. It's a meme. I don't actually need it. Thanks for checking the video out. Get it? Check.
Please clap.
Lake Baikal is a fascinating place. The deepest rift lake in the world, astonishingly beautiful during the winters, and the home of a really tasty little fish that only comes from it. I travelled to this part of Russia back in 2016, and I'm glad I did because that trip gave me the perspective on the world I have today. During this little trip, I came across a fascinating little bit of information about the lake during the Russian Civil War that just blew my mind. And that was icebreaker combat. I found this out when I went on quite possibly the worst maintained museum ship I have ever seen in my entire life. And for those who don't know, I travel to different parts of the world purely to see museum ships and then pretend to my family that, oh, we're here for a holiday, not actually to let me gawk at HMS Victory for about an hour and go, oh, look how nice this holiday is. No, I'm going for the boats. The holiday is the bonus. But this little museum ship was the icebreaker, Angara. And the Angara had this little plaque on its lower decks where there was this sort of makeshift theatre room set up with some old looking projector. And it was this word,
Now, I can't really pronounce that in the right sort of accent without giving away what it is. But I was about 18 at the time, and I didn't understand too much, if all, any Cyrillic. But I recognised that word, and I had this moment where I just turned around and said really loudly, well, not really loudly, it was just echoed because the thing's empty, "What the fuck?" Because 18-year-old me had just discovered that the Czechoslovakians, yeah, that word means Czechoslovakia, the very landlocked Czechoslovakians, had fought and won a naval battle against the Russians. This is the tale of the Battle of Lake Baikal, and how Russia lost to a country that is quite literally hundreds of kilometers from the sea. Now you may be wondering, and rightly so, just how does a Czech or a Slovak get on a boat in the middle of Siberia, and how does this lead to Russia losing a naval battle? Well, the answer is actually really simple, and I'm shocked you even have to ask. See, all you need is an archduke to get shot, which in turn triggers a worldwide conflict based on multiple complex alliances, all vying to both simultaneously establish and prevent a European hegemon from forming. And on top of that, you need a German to decide that Belgium is a good highway, 100,000 British professionals who can fire rifles like machine guns to break up the German advance, a failed campaign to seize Gallipoli coupled with 100 years of really crappy rule from Moscow, an exiled revolutionary moronic Tsar, a Siberian wizard dude with a big schlong to sleep with the Tsarina, a mishmash of empire, about 100 cultures or so in a trench coat that annoys people, in said empire so much so that they go off to join foreign militaries to fight it. Oh, and you need a guy called Trotsky to do something extremely, and I mean extremely bloody stupid. Simple, right? Don't know why you had to question it. See, as the First World War got going, the Austro-Hungarian Empire found itself quite literally on the brink before the war even started. It's kind of why Ferdinand got shot in the first place. Which is really funny, because side note here, Ferdinand, the Archduke Ferdinand, was the one who wanted to give the Southern Slavs more rights in the Empire, so the Southern Slav terrorist group shot him when he was the only one advocating for them to get more rights. Serbia is an interesting place. This empire, though, the Austro-Hungarians, was an absolute mess of crowns, and fun fact, this isn't actually the flag of Austria-Hungary. Hoi4 has lied to you. It's the naval ensign. The state was such a mess that there wasn't actually a flag for the state. I'm not even joking, there were multiple. Within this abomination of a state, held together by mostly the sheer power of Franz Josef's moustache, along with some military power sprinkled in, existed the region of Bohemia, aka the future Czech Republic, and to the east, technically inside of Hungary, which was inside of the Austro-Hungarian Empire but was sort of separate but sort of not, was Slovakia. Together, they formed the dynamic duo of Czechoslovakia. The Czech bit of the duo included some of the most industrialised parts of the empire and really all of Europe, with brands such as Skoda headquartered there, and the inhabitants of the region had their own culture and way of life. Quite frankly, the Czechoslovakians together were absolutely sick and tired of being under Austria and, well, Hungary's thumbs. And they wanted independence. Not only did they want independence, but they were more than prepared to fight for it too. Seeing that the Austro-Hungarians were intent on going full tilt into Serbia for the shooting of the Archduke, men from Czechoslovakia, the majority of them were Czech, signed up and volunteered to join the war, fighting on the side of the Russian or French armies as a part of what would become known as the Czechoslovak Legion. Their motto was simply Nazda, or hello. The Legion, officially established in 1917 after years of hard fighting as smaller individual units, would find itself in the thick of combat during the war, often being reinforced by deserters who believed in a free Czechoslovakia, or more commonly by prisoners of war who were fed up with Austria's crap. In total, there were about 13,000 legionnaires in Italy, 9,600 in France, and a whopping lion's share of 50,000 in the Russian Empire. The only problem was, Russia had been beaten 6 ways from Sunday during the war, and it had just woken up from the latest beating with a slightly different personality change. I don't get the hype around Trotsky. I really don't. And I mean, Trotsky is such a Stalinist who wished they got to crush people with tanks anyway. So many people say that Trotsky is a super baker genius, but when you actually read into some of the things he gets up to, some of his theories and foreign policy decisions, he just seems like an absolute moron who thinks he knows better and somehow has managed to convince everyone that he has a brain. He's like the Wikipedia user on YouTube who makes videos. And then, has convinced everyone he's an expert. Don't know who I'm talking about there. Wonder who I mean by that. Basically, everything that happens from now on is on Trotsky's gigabrain and his plans to deal with both the Germans and the Czechoslovaks. Naturally, just because the Bolsheviks took power, the war against Germany didn't exactly stop, but for all intents and purposes, Russia's goose was effectively cooked. It lacked both material and motivation to continue the war. The Soviets under Lenin understood this, and although he would have loved to throw the Germans back to Berlin declaring communist utopias along the way, it really just wasn't possible. So Lenin, being the ultimate upper manager, sent his underling Trotsky to go and negotiate with the Germans, a peace deal that would allow the Russians to focus on pacifying the Soviet Empire, Russian Soviet Socialist Federative Republic, of total equals. So Trotsky, on his little mission from the boss, rocks up to Brest-Litovsk and has a chat with Oberkommando Ostfront Max Hoffmann and Foreign Minister Richard von Kuhlmann. Yes, the Austro-Hungarians and Ottomans were there, but like all negotiations at this point in the war, nobody really listened to them, and Germany was kind of just embarrassed to be seen with them. Trotsky, in this regard, was acting as the Soviet foreign minister, and he wasn't entirely pleased at the German terms, which, let's be clear, were horrifically brutal for the Russian economic prospects. There's a reason why the Treaty of Versailles was so horrific. It's because what the Germans did at Brest-Litovsk was a pretty well the equivalent. The Germans, acting on previous promises to Poles to get them on side, intended to liberate swaths of Polish territory. Now remember, Poland before the war, the heartland, was effectively all under Russian control. They also intended to establish a Baltic government in the, well, shockingly, Baltic states, and establish influence over the newly self-declared independent states of Belarus and Ukraine. The Central Powers sought these terms to effectively fix the looming food crisis that had been caused by the British naval blockade, and having access to the breadbasket of Europe, along with a massive new buffer region against any Russian counter-resurgence, meant that there would now be a giant army group able to move east to try and kick the Allies out before, well, the Triple Entente out, before the Allies, as they become to be known, form when the United States starts to arrive in force. Trotsky, though, knew that Russia couldn't fight this, even if it couldn't accept the terms, so he put his 2.5 brain cells together and decided he had this marvelous idea that he could just say the war is over, and it would be over. So our intrepid little communist walks into the meetings, right? Turns around to Kuhlmann and Hoffmann, and he says, "The war is over," and he leaves. The Germans, being their humorous selves, were not even remotely amused, and shockingly, to absolutely nobody's surprise, they just went, "Right, okay," and ordered their lines to advance. But you see, this is where Trotsky's genius comes into play, because he had this idea, right, that if the Russians just declare that the war is over, and the Germans advance, then the Germans will be attacking a neutral country, and the whole world's workers will rise up in revolt, because they're attacking the workers' paradise. Are you shocked to know that did not happen? Lenin wasn't exactly impressed here, and after having a go at Trotsky for being a fuckwit, ordered him back to the Germans, cap in hand, to accept the now even harsher treaties, because when Trotsky went back, he discovered that the independent Ukraine was acting totally independently and had signed a peace treaty with the Germans as an independent nation, and they now had German backing, and there were German troops in Kiev. That's strike one for Trotsky's brilliance. It turns out, when you're in a massive worldwide war that is causing hundreds of thousands of casualties, you can't just turn around and go, "Nuh-uh." So now, back to the Legion, and let's set the scene. It's the 14th of May 1918. Russia has finished its personality change from horrific empire with gold everywhere to horrific empire with red everywhere, but the state was about as stable as a house built on sand. At the time, the Legion found itself in the newly independent Ukraine, and given Ukraine was sort of under German protection, this is just before Brest-Litovsk, and there were a lot of Germans in the territory, the 40,000 or so Czechoslovaks were understandably a little nervous. The Ukrainians, though, likely feeling sympathetic to a group of people forced to live in a giant empire that they didn't want to, gave the Legion permission to leave Ukraine unmolested to make its way east. See, the Czechoslovaks were in a bit of predicament here, because they obviously can't go west because, well, Austria-Hungary rules their homeland. They can't go south because the Ottomans are there. They can't go north because it's straight to the Bolsheviks, and they don't really have supplies even if they can beat them militarily, which they will, a lot, but we'll get into that. So they have to travel from Ukraine all the way to Vladivostok, where they can try and get on a boat and travel to either France, Britain or the United States to continue the fight or to, well, settle down. But the signing of Brest-Litovsk makes this really complicated because although the Ukrainians themselves don't care that the Czechs are there because they're leaving, the Germans want to get rid of 40,000 really highly experienced crack infantry that forms the backbone of the Czechoslovak Legion before it can end up reinforcing the Entente. The only problem is that the Soviets had so thoroughly screwed the peace negotiations, and the Germans were now advancing again during Operation Volkslag, that the Czechoslovaks had to now start fighting their way to even get out of Ukraine to continue to fight to get home. The Czechoslovaks fought and defeated the Germans at the Battle of Baikal north of Kiev. Knowing that if they lost they were subject to execution by the Austro-Hungarians, they fought a force that outnumbered them significantly to an absolute standstill with such ferocity that they were able to break away. The Bolsheviks meanwhile didn't like the Legion, but on the flip side they needed the Legion to avoid looking too pro-Central Powers and avoid an invasion from the Entente. But see, the thing about communists, in particular this variety of stupid Trotsky flavour, is that they have major trust issues. Now the Legion just wanted to leave. I can't stress that enough. The Czechs and the Slovaks just wanted to leave. That's all they wanted. But the railway was mostly single tracks, and the Bolsheviks were so busy trying to get rid of as many Central Powers prisoners of war as possible, in line with the terms of Brest-Litovsk, that the Legion sort of got stuck in different places, and part of the Legion was stuck at the city of Chelyabinsk, trying to head east while a train full of Hungarians were heading west. And the Soviet Union's a complete mishmash. It's not the Soviet Union yet, but I'm calling it that because I'm not saying Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic about 50 times. But the Soviets were just a complete mess at the time. There's no real way they can get around this. They have to follow the treaty. But the problem is the Hungarians that were passing through on this happenstance day were fervent loyalists to Austria-Hungary and to the crown. And they started throwing barbs at the Legion, who they saw as traitors, calling them traitors, saying they deserve to die, yada yada yada. In response, the Czechs started throwing insults back, and eventually, somebody picked up a rock and threw it, striking somebody in the head, and bang, there's a riot. Trotsky and the Bolsheviks, going on their full Red Terror phase now, decided that they would use the riot as an excuse to order the Legion to disarm and hand over their weapons, promising them passage east, even though they'd already done that and then sort of left them stuck. The Legion meanwhile turned around and said, "No way in hell am I giving you these weapons, because you will just kill us." And yeah, fair call considering the wider picture and the Red Terror that was unfolding. The Czechs flat out said they just wanted to leave, that's all they wanted, but they would leave on their own accord with their own arms. Trotsky, being an idiot, naturally tripled down and went, "Give me your guns." And lo and behold, the literal army of professionals that had just broken the German advance on Operation Volkslag, when they were outnumbered and outgunned, turned around and said no. That's strike two for Trotsky. He now leaves our story, but don't worry, he continues his little mess up of decisions right up until he gets ice-picked in Mexico. But we are now all caught up with the Legion holding the railway, the lifeline to the Russian Far East that Trotsky knew that they were there to do, and then he pissed them off. While the Legion was just trying to leave, and then the White Army and the Red Army now use this opportunity to start going at each other's throats. And that brings us to August 1918, where the Legion is attempting to seize control over the mountain passes around Lake Baikal, which are under complete control of the Reds. As the Legion continued east to make its way out of the combat zone into Vladivostok, part of the force under the command of Radola Gaj's path was blocked by the greatest of all enemies, geography. Between them and the freedom of Vladivostok stood the exceedingly long but relatively narrow Lake Baikal. Naturally, when you have a big body of water in front of you, your first thought is, alright, well, we'll go around it. But there was a key issue here because the region was a hotbed for Bolshevik activity, so the area to the immediate east and the city of Irkutsk proper, well, it was a complete hotbed for the Reds with its industrial working class. So the Legion was stuck. They couldn't go north because it's quite literally the Siberian wasteland. They can't go south into Mongolia due to supply lines, and of course the key mountain passes, they're all held by the Reds. There was really nowhere to go except for straight over it. But hang on, ho, how does a legion of soldiers using trains cross a giant lake? Well, I'm glad you asked. See, there's a trick to this. The answer is crime. As the Legion moved into the coastline of Lake Baikal, it began to occupy a series of ports along the coast, and in these ports, they found two steamships sitting pretty in harbour, the Siberjak and Feodosia, and they stole them and positioned them in the port's town of Listvianka, where they found 4 howitzers and strapped them to the decks. The Czechoslovakians now had a navy. A couple of miles away in Misovsk sat the Russian Lake Baikal naval flotilla, and it consisted of the Baikal and the Angara, on the shore being supported by an armoured train which was sort of, going back and forward. Now, back to geography. Keep in mind the Trans-Siberian Railway runs right alongside Lake Baikal and is well within range of any kind of aquatically based boomstick. Keep in mind as well that the majority of the Czechs and Slovak were spread out across Siberia at this point, and there was a severe concern that if the group that was at the lake passed east, yeah, they'd get through, but the Russians might just sail across the lake, land troops behind them, and split the Legion in two, cutting off and killing all of their comrades. This ultimately was the region that the Czechs seized those 2 ships and strapped guns on them, but the Legion was not waiting around for the Reds to just attack, and they were going to be a bit more proactive. On the 15th of August, 1918, the Legionnaires' little dynamic duo set sail to disable the other major port at Yusovsk, where the Reds were sitting with their 2 ships and, well, an armoured train. Now, I couldn't find much information about the exact specifications of the Czechoslovakian steamers, nothing I could verify with a second source or third source at least, but we know a fair bit about the ones used by the Reds, mostly because one is a museum ship, coated in gunk and crap in Irkutsk, and they were both actually flat pack imports from the United Kingdom, quite literally IKEA style. It will be absolutely no shock to anyone to hear that the Russian shipbuilding situation in Siberia wasn't exactly doing so hot in the 1910s. That, coupled with the fact all the Imperial shipyards and basically every other shipyard was busy trying to replace the ships lost at Tsushima, and before that they were desperately trying to build up their naval forces in preparation for, the fact everyone else was doing it. The smart thing to do here, and what the local officials did in the late 1800s, was to order a pair of ships from the United Kingdom, at the time the world's premier shipbuilder and exporter. These 2 ships were the Angara, named for the river that the city of Irkutsk is built on and it feeds into the lake, and the other was named for the lake itself, the Baikal. In early 1895, the construction of the Baikal began at Armstrong and Whitworth in Newcastle upon Tyne, and it was pretty damn big. It was designed to carry a train, 300 passengers as well, and it weighed in at around 4,200 tons. She would be built and then sent in parts, like I said, IKEA style, to the lake overland on the train, where she was assembled over 3 years in a small village that she dwarfed on the lakeside. Her companion was the slightly smaller passenger goods vessel, the Angara, and it was built and sent in much the same way. Angara will come back into the story soon. I've got something to say about that boat, because good lord does it have a tail. The Legion's flotilla set off on a relatively uneventful cruise across the lake, where they encountered the SS Baikal tied up to the mooring at Misovsk, and armed to the teeth, with makeshift weapons bolted on the deck, much in the same way as the Czechs had done. The crew on the Baikal assumed that the ships approaching it were friendly, and you know what? I don't blame them. Who on God's green earth expects the Czechoslovakian Navy to randomly appear in central Siberia? The Legion, seeing the gigantic Baikal, set to work and set it alight, peppering it from stem to stern and sinking it at its moorings, possibly before it even got a shot away. The Legion then moved in closer and shelled the port at Misovsk for a few minutes. In response, the Reds brought up an armoured train and returned fire at the ships, who broke off and returned back to their ports. As they turned back though, they encountered the Angara, which, likely knowing what happened to the Baikal, because it could probably see it burning like a matchstick at this point, turned off and sailed away as fast as possible, in the other direction. The Czechoslovakians had officially beaten the Bolsheviks and won a naval battle, which gives the unique distinction to the Czechs and the Slovaks of having won every single naval battle they have ever fought. Which is one. They have fought one naval battle and they won it. While the battle wasn't exactly definitive in the grand scheme of things, it's quite funny that the Russians lost to a country that is so far landlocked it can't see the sea, let alone reach it. The Czechoslovaks had secured a land route to the east, and with the success of the Legion in Siberia, finally, the Legion got the help it needed to get out of Russia. The Allies would intervene in the war, opening up the Trans-Baikal region, and more than that, the Czechoslovaks began to receive genuine support from the major powers for the future of an independent Czechoslovakia after the war had ended. See, this wasn't a definitive battle, it wasn't huge, it wasn't massive, but it was just a little part of a much wider war, but it was a key part in getting the Czechoslovak Legion home. Now this is normally where the video would end, all wrapped up in a little bow, but there's just one more thing we need to discuss, and that's the wild ride of the Angara. Because after the revolution, it holds the honour of dubiously being quite possibly the most ever sunk ship in the world. See, while the Baikal sat sunk at the jetty until 1920, the Angara would go on to ply its way back and forward across the lake for 62 more years. Sort of. During the 1920s, the ship was on a short voyage when she struck rocks near the Ushanki Islands. She was later raised and returned to service. The Angara would technically be retired in 1961 without any further incident in those 40 years and laid up at Port Baikal. But I mean, we've all seen what Russian long-term storage does, right? Because in the 70s and 80s, she deteriorated so badly that she sank not once, not twice, but 3 times at her port. The third time left her on the bottom for 7 whole years. Eventually, the Angara was raised again in the late 80s and semi-restored, and today she sits on the shores of the lake in the city of Irkutsk as a museum ship. According to the museum when I was there, part of the reason she was restored, and this is based on a translation I got at the time, was as part of the celebrations of the glorious October Revolution and the Civil War and yada yada yada. You get the picture. Glory to the Soviet Union, that kind of stuff. The museum itself really isn't in the best shape though, and there's no heating or much ventilation, so in the winter she's an icebox, which is when I went. In the summer she's a sweatbox. She stinks of paint, grease, grime, and whatever other chemicals they're using on it. The hull shows it's aged and rust. There's some significant and obvious weaknesses in the ship's structure. If you poke too hard on some of the interior walls, then your finger will actually bellow the wall because it's so rusted. The paint is just slapped on this rust, and well, in general, there's a lot of grime and gunk throughout the ship. So it's hard to tell whether or not it's in active service, honestly, with the Russian Navy. At least this was the case in 2016 when I visited her. But that's just the little story of the Angara, and honestly, even with her state being heartbreaking to say the least, having an icebreaker steamship from the 1800s sitting around that, you know, fought a naval battle against the Czechoslovakians, well, it didn't really fight, it kind of ran away, but you get the picture, is pretty damn cool. Interestingly, the museum also has the guns on the Angara, which, 2 stories based on the person who was there that I spoke to and then had it translated to me who runs the museum. Either the guns were the originals, which were thrown in the hull and just forgotten about and left there because they didn't know what to do with them, or they're just guns that were randomly found in a warehouse and then bolted on board, and they don't really know where they came from. It's possible, it's really unlikely, and it's impossible to prove without going and examining it, but they did tell me it was possible at the time, and I don't know how much of this is true or not, that they were actually guns left over by the Czechoslovak Legion, which, if true, would be absolutely hilarious. I just hope that the Angara manages to survive the impending doom of, the Russian misery and economy when the population inevitably collapses because they all shouted "Oorah" and yeeted themselves into Ukraine's border. As per the usual, thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and all that jazz. I've created a second channel for VOD uploads and maybe one or two other silly things, so give it a look and a subscribe. Thank you again to my completely awesome patrons. Your support is always welcomed and always appreciated.
Chances are, if you grew up in the West during the Cold War, or if you haven't specifically gone looking for information about it, you may never heard of the name Varyag. Well, maybe you have, and maybe it springs to mind that Wunderwaffe cruiser also called the Varyag. But if we look back a little further, we find that it was the name of a cruiser from the Imperial Russian Navy that was actually built in Philadelphia and served as one of the exceptions, to the rule of inadequacy and insane incompetency that was the Russian Navy at sea during the Russo-Japanese War. However, this story of the Russian Navy, and oh boy does it end in a wacky, horrific way with a lot of self-sacrifice and being sold out by the High Command, because it's, well, a story about the Russian Navy. It's worth visiting. So without further ado, let's wade into the story of the last stand of the cruiser Varyag. Varyag began life in October 1898 in the United States of America. Russia at the time was going through an intense period of fleet modification, and the domestic shipyards were full of new projects. And so, as with many of the contracts of the period, the order went out to tender, and the American yard won the contract. Varyag was actually named for the Varangian Guard, the famous elite shock infantry that served the Byzantine Empire during the medieval period, made up of warriors from both Scandinavia and the Kievan Rus. She would be launched barely a year later, on the 31st of October 1899, before being commissioned into the Imperial Russian Navy on the 2nd of January 1901. In typical Russian Navy fashion, the drama began before the ship even hit the water, as the ship's assistant physician Leo Alexandrov absconded from his crew, who had been sent as an advance party in preparation for the ship's commissioning on the 20th of April 1899. Alexandrov was actually ballsy enough to apply for US citizenship, but was arrested for desertion. His case actually reached the Supreme Court, and the ruling was known as Tucker versus Alexandrov, and it stated that although Varyag was yet accepted into Russian naval service, it was still a warship under the terms of the 1832 treaty between the two countries, and so his conviction and beatings that were about to come would stick. Upon commissioning, the ship was painted in white, gold, and black, with many commenting that they thought she was one of the most beautiful warships they had ever seen. Which, I mean, I see it. Varyag is gorgeous. The Varyag, though, did appear to be somewhat lacking for her intended role as a protected cruiser. See, Varyag was armed with a battery of 12 6-inch guns and single turret along her sides, which for the time was quite good, with an additional 12 3-inch guns, 8 1.9-inch guns, and 2 1.5-inch guns. On top of that, she also carried 6 15-inch torpedo tubes, with one in the bow, one in the stern, and 2 per side. All of this on a hull about 129.6 meters long and 15.8 meters wide. Now, this all sounds fantastic. She displaced approximately 6,500 tons, but her armor, it was very light. And I mean very light for her role. And to make matters worse, there were effectively no armor shields on the guns, and if there were armor shields on the guns, they were quite small and very thin to protect these gun crews from flash and shrapnel. The problems were further compounded when it was realised that the ship could actually only go 23 knots instead of the contracted 25. Now, it's only 2 knots, but that 2 knots makes a big difference. These drawbacks in design, however, seemed of little note to the Russian crew, who seemed to greatly admire their new ship. By all accounts, the ship was far more comfortable than the ones built back in the Imperial yards back in the Empire. Shock horror. Now, on that quickly, I'm referring to them as Russian sailors and Russian crew. They are not all Russian. Remember, the Russian Empire conquered and subjected many, many different nationalities and cultures. So there's Kazakhs, there's Ukrainians, Belarusians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Uzbekis, Tajikis, Ulanu, I can keep going, there's a lot in there, but you get the gist. Anyway, in May 1901, the ship arrived back in the Empire at the Kronstadt naval base, the one that the Reds blew up the sailors for rebelling after the sailors helped them, near the Russian capital city of St. Petersburg, and it attracted many visitors, including the royal family. The royal family and their retinue of courtiers were delighted with the ship. However, the mother of Tsar Nicholas II allegedly did know that the cruiser would likely not handle taking damage well, but the ship's crew did not seem to share the anxiety or worry. It's not like they would have to worry about a war where they were going. Varyag, shortly after her stay in Kronstadt, sailed for the Russian Far East, straight into the arms of destiny. The ship was then based in Port Arthur, in the Yellow Sea, at the time a Russian possession, and an all-important warm water port in the east. In December 1903, the cruiser was ordered to serve as a hospital ship in Chernobyl, near Seoul, in what is today South Korea, but to also stand by to defend the Russian embassy if the need arose. This was, for the time period, the norm, as the hospital ships, aka gunboat diplomats, for the British Empire, France and the United States, and Italy were also at the site. Now, at this critical juncture in history, the Varyag and its accompanying little gunboat, the Komsomolets, were ordered to support the embassy against any provocation due to the near-constant political struggle between the Japanese and the Russian empires for control over the Korean peninsula. This in part fueled by the fact that Tsar Nicholas II almost got killed in Japan and had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. The Russians, sensing that with the Chinese Empire falling back and breaking down under, well, a century of shame, they thought, well, it might be our turn to dominate the Far East. In reality, Varyag was being used as a pawn. She was isolated from the main fleet in Port Arthur, and being used seemingly as a hostage by the Tsar and the naval command. The reasoning was that if the Japanese attacked first, then Russia, well, it would be seen as the defender against a savage aggressor, who had no morality and honour to attack a peaceful vessel engaged in diplomatic endeavours. Because hey, it's just the lives of the sailors on board, and we all know how important human life is to the Russian government and high command. Isn't it funny how the more things change, the more they stay the same? The jig was up though, and Japan broke off all communications to the Russian Empire. The Varyag, commanded by Captain Visvold Rudnev, had to guess as best he could what the situation was in regard to the openness of the conflict because he had absolutely no idea what was going on. They did not know on board Varyag or Komsomolets that Japanese destroyers, for example, had attacked the fleet in Port Arthur. On the Japanese side, a powerful squadron formed up outside Chernobyl Bay under Rear Admiral Uryu Satoguchi, comprising of 6 cruisers, multiple torpedo boats, a smaller Viso, and 2,500 soldiers in their transports, appearing intent on landing. The protected cruiser Chiyoda had been based in Chernobyl for the last 10 months and kept a close eye on the Russian ships. On the 7th of February, the Angara, a Russian transport, arrived and gave news to Captain Rudnev that the aforementioned Japanese fleet was approaching. Komsomolets was ordered to Port Arthur to get instruction and slipped out of Chernobyl on the 8th of February. Komsomolets, however, ran into Chiyoda just outside the port and mistook it for a Russian vessel. Only after closing in did the Russian crew realise their error and, in the ensuing confusion, fired its guns, which had been loaded as a salute for a friendly ship, putting on quite the display of fireworks. Interestingly, later on when the 2nd Pacific Squadron, yes, the Voyage of the Damned one, arrived at Tsushima to get its, well, back blown out, it too mistook Japanese ships for Russian warships. Should have gone to Specsavers. Chiyoda rapidly responded to this firework display with a torpedo launch, and although both sides missed, this was actually the first exchange of what would become the Russo-Japanese War. Komsomolets retreated rapidly into the safety of Chernobyl harbour, and it was by now too late to escape clearly, and Varyag and Komsomolets were effectively stranded and under siege. To this day, it is unclear who fired the first shot in this engagement, but that's of little importance because both sides were pretty set on slapping each other around. Later that morning, Chiyoda made contact with Rear Admiral Uryu and his fleet at the harbour entrance and reported the following ships were in the bay: HMS Talbot of the British Empire, USS Vicksburg, shockingly from the United States, Elba from Italy, and Pascal from France. The presence of foreign warships in the anchorage proved somewhat of a difficult situation for the Japanese admiral, because as intent as the Japanese were at removing the Russians from Chernobyl and, well, Korea in general, starting a war with the 3 of the 4 most powerful navies on Earth at the time was not exactly in the nation's best interest. This was not yet full send-it Japan, that comes a bit later in history. The Japanese admiral, knowing that his country was not able to single-handedly fight the entire world, a point seemingly that would be forgotten in about 40 years' time, sent a message to the captains of the foreign vessels asking if they would slightly move their ships away from the Russian warships that were effectively using them as meat shields, promising not to attack before 1600 hours that day, never mind the fact that it was completely illegal under international law to attack a ship, whether it be an enemy or not, whilst it was in a neutral port. It is still the Imperial Japanese Empire after all. Uryu ordered his cruisers Chiyoda, Takachio, and Asama, accompanied by various torpedo boats, to sail through the channel, accompanying the troop ships, in order to not delay any disembarkation of soldiers. Meanwhile, he left 3 cruisers, Naniwa, Nitaka, and Akashi, with 3 torpedo boats in the rear as a reserve force. By 1800, on the 8th of February, the troop ships had anchored in Chemulpo, right next to the Varyag, and they disembarked their soldiers. At 0300 the next morning, the offloading of soldiers was complete, and after a very tense 11 hours, all Japanese ships, save for Chiyoda, withdrew. Chiyoda delivered the following letter to the ships of each nation docked in the bay, including the Varyag. His Imperial Japanese Majesty's ship, Naniwa, Chemulpo Roadstead, February 8th, 1904. Sir, I have the honour to notify you that hostilities exist between the Empire of Japan and the Empire of Russia. At present, I shall attack the men of war of the government of Russia, stationed at present in the port of Chemulpo, with the force under my command. In case of the refusal of the Russian senior naval officer present at Chemulpo to my demand to leave the port of Chemulpo before noon on the 9th of February 1904, and I respectfully request you to keep away from the scene of action in the port, so that no danger from the action would come to the ship under your command. The above-mentioned attack will not take place before 4 o'clock p.m. on the 9th of February 1904, to give time to put into practice the above-mentioned requests. If there are any transports or merchant vessels of your nationality in the port of Chemulpo at present, I request you to communicate to them the above notification. I have the honour, sir, to be your most obedient servant, S. Uryu. A conference was called aboard HMS Talbot by Captain Rudnev, almost immediately after the respective captains of each ship had read the letter from Admiral Uryu. He said plainly that the Russian ships would have to fight their way out of the anchorage. The captains of the neutral warships in the bay attempted to advise the Russian commander that it would be more prudent to just surrender because, well, it was suicide. But Captain Rudnev was adamant that Varyag and Kuriets would fight their way out of the trap they were in, probably knowing that if he surrendered, well, it wasn't long for this world when he got back to Russia. At noon, the captain of HMS Talbot, Dennis Bagley, made his way to Naniwa with a letter signed by all of the neutral captains in the anchorage, save for the captain of USS Vicksburg, stating that they would not move their anchorage, as Chemulpo was, as previously stated, a neutral port. Perhaps the refusal of the neutral ships to move was meant as a way to convince the Russian captain to keep his ships in port and hold out. If it was, then the effort was made in vain, because at 11 o'clock on the 9th of February, Captain Visvold Rudnev and his 2 ships made a break for it. The following account of the battle, as it should be noted, comes directly from the logbook of the Varyag, so it is completely from the Varyag's perspective. We're not looking at the Japanese perspective at all here. At 11:10 in the morning, all hands assembled on the deck of the Varyag as she headed out to sea with Kuriets, approximately 1 cable length or 200 metres astern, with the British and Italian crews cheering for the Russian crew. On board Elba, the Italian band actually played the Russian national anthem, which at the time was called God Save the Tsar. At 11:25, the Russian crew goes to battle stations, with the Japanese cruisers forming a battle line in front of their supporting torpedo boats. It should be noted at the time the Varyag had spent a significant amount of time in that port, and so had the other warships, so they had quite friendly relations at the time. At 11:45, Varyag opened fire with the guns on her port side, responded to in kind 2 minutes later with Asama responding with her much larger and more powerful 8-inch guns. This was followed straight away by the entire Japanese fleet opening fire. The Japanese fire was highly accurate, and one of the first shells managed to destroy the port wing of the bridge, setting a fire at the chart house and killing the junior navigation officer, along with immobilizing all of the crew effectively nearby the rangefinder. As Japanese fire continued, the guns along the Varyag began to be destroyed and damaged beyond immediate repair. At 12:05, after passing the traverse of Yoldoni Island, the Varyag was critically damaged when the rudder drive took a hit. At the same time, a shell hit the foremast and took out the bridge, and the ship's wheel tearing through the bridge crew. The cruiser was ordered to steam full astern in the hope that she would be able to extend the range and get out of fire, but the damage to the rudder was just too much and it jammed. The Japanese cruisers closed in and tore the Varyag apart with rapid fire. The Varyag hit back, striking the Osama, which turned away and stopped firing, buying them a bit of time, but it really made no difference whatsoever. By 12:45, it was completely over. The Varyag was able to slowly limp back and dropped anchor near the British, French and Italian ships, who rendered aid to the wounded, while the remaining crew made their way to the Russian transport ship the Angara. Just as this was occurring, the captain of the Korets blew the powder magazines on his ship, and very nearly showered the neutral warships who were conducting a medical operation and the Angara, which was evacuating sailors, with debris and shell fragments, because he didn't sail away to do it properly. The captains, naturally worried, begged Rudnev to not blow the Varyag up in the same manner, because it would blow their ships up. And, well, he agreed, not being an idiot and realizing what was going on. It's really refreshing, isn't it, to talk about a Russian captain who's not completely stupid? The Varyag was scuttled and rolled over and sank at about 8:10, but crucially her hull remained intact. It was just a matter of opening the seacocks and letting the ship settle into the water. The Russian crew on the Angara, fearing capture, actually just burned the Angara, and they would later be repatriated back to Russia on neutral vessels. In all, 33 sailors had been killed on Varyag and 97 had been wounded. Both ships had been lost, and the Japanese, meanwhile, had barely been scratched. You would think this is the end for the Varyag, but this is actually just the beginning. After the war ended, Japan started to look around at the dozens of destroyed and surrendered Russian warships, and it began to realise that there was a fair chance it could put a few of them into service to help make up the numbers margin against other European powers. One of these ships was the pretty well-designed, protected cruiser that was sitting in the water in Chernobyl harbour. The Japanese Navy set to work, and after a bit of effort they managed to raise the hull, which was, while damaged, in a pretty damn good condition. After some repairs, the ship was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy as the Soya, named for the northernmost cape of Hokkaido, an area comically close to Russia. Soya would serve in the Imperial Japanese Navy as a general-purpose cruiser, not a frontline cruiser, but a bit of a jack-of-all-trades, masters-of-none cruiser. But also, crucially, her new role included the job as a training cruiser, and the whole point was to teach junior officers navigation and how to navigate long distances at sea. Remember, at the time, there's no radar, and the ship would make annual voyages to Hawaii between 1909 and 1913. Interestingly enough, some of the officers trained on Varyag, now Soya, would later take part in the December 7th, 1941 raid on Pearl Harbor, navigating their way to the islands using lessons taken from the ship. That is the most useless trivia fact you'll ever know, but enjoy. As 1913 gave way to 1914, Russia and Japan would again find themselves at war, but this time as allies against the Central Powers. By this point though, the Soya, well, it was showing its age. And you know, she'd literally already been sunk once, so that does have an effect on a ship. The decision was therefore made in Japan to offer up for sale some of the warships captured from the Russians during the Russo-Japanese War. The Russians, in a twofold case of one being a little too obsessed with saving face, and two, desperately needing ships because it was getting pummeled by Germany, jumped at the chance, and it repurchased the old dreadnoughts Peresibet and Poltava, along with the ex-Soya, now again named Varyag, at Vladivostok on the 5th of April 1916. Interestingly, out of respect for the Varyag's last stand in combat, the Japanese never removed the name Varyag from the ship's hull, even though it was called Soya. In June that year, 1916, the ship departed from Murmansk via the Indian Ocean, where she arrived in 1916. Varyag, though, was not in the best of shape and was really showing her age, and so, after some celebrations, she was sent to Liverpool for overhaul by Camel shipyards in February 1917. The idea being that she would be prepared to join the Russian Arctic flotilla, but in October that year, crewmen aboard joined the October Revolution and hoisted the red flag, refusing to sail. Britain was having absolutely none of this revolution stuff. It was already dealing with enough problems. And so it sent soldiers aboard to seize the ship, which was then given to the Royal Navy to do with whatever it wanted. The new Russian government flat out refused to pay for the ship's refit, and in February 1918, while being towed to Ireland, the ship ran aground. Raised and then used as a hulk until 1919, the ship with absolutely no purpose whatsoever would be sold to a German firm in 1920 for scrapping. A seemingly ignominious end for a ship with such an interesting history. But the old Varyag had one more trick to pull, and on the 5th of February 1920, she ran aground on the rocks near the Scottish village of Leadenfoot in the Firth of Clyde. The decision was made to therefore scrap her in place from 1923 to 1925, and today there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever, save for the remains of the bell in St. Petersburg and the ship's ensign, which is actually on loan from South Korea to Russia, that the ship existed at all. The name Varyag actually caught on as a bit of legendary tradition in the Russian Imperial, but also the Soviet Navy, as another one of those heroic stands against the old story, the unbreakable spirit, yada yada yada, those things. There's even a song about it. In reality, the Varyag was sent alone with a small gunboat to a position effectively as bait. Bait to start a war that the Tsar cockily thought would just be a matter of firing a few shots and putting Japan to heel. The crew fought the Japanese as best they could. The captain fought as best he could as well. But like the 2nd Pacific Squadron to follow, they died for absolutely nothing more than the Imperial Tsar's quest for glory through military conquest. Which I suppose at the end of the day, I guess it really does make sense that this is one of the legends that the Russian Navy likes to follow. Today, there's a new Varyag. Well, newish, there's actually been a couple. The one today is one of the very old Slava-class cruisers, and it is the sister to the Ukrainian cultural heritage site Moskva. The Russian Navy actually tried to get her into the Black Sea in late 2022, early 2023, but due to treaties surrounding the Bosphorus, they couldn't actually get her into the war zone. The modern Varyag's original name, though, was Chervona Ukraina, and it spent its days bobbing about the Pacific Ocean, one of only now 2 Slava-class cruisers. Interestingly enough, before that there was another Varyag. It was the aircraft carrier Varyag, sister to the Admiral Kuznetsov, and it is now, after being towed halfway around the world, in Chinese service as Lianglong. Thank you all for joining me for another fun little episode of Misery at Sea, aka known as the history of the Russian Navy. Like, comment, subscribe, join the Discord, and I will catch you all next time. Also, I do apologise for the birds and any construction noises in the background. There is currently roadworks going on in front of my house. I can't stop them because I want that road fixed, and I'm just a random guy who will go and scream at them and then get arrested because it's roadworks. You can deal with it, it'll be fine. I'll put some funny music in the background. (1986) was not a great year for the Soviet Union in all honesty. Not great, not terrible at least. There was the whole exploding nuclear reactor thing going on at Chernobyl, but not to worry, it was only spewing out a bit of burnt concrete and 3.6 Rotkin, although somehow it was making everyone that went near it turn into goo. But not to worry, the state said it will be fixed and there is nothing to worry about, and they would never lie to the people that they represent.
Внимание! 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 Внимание!
Well, it can't get any worse, can it? It's not like food is getting harder to get and afford, and nobody wants to work anymore, and everyone just wants to sit and watch their TVs. Just forget about it, and take a cruise on the half-century-old captured Weimar-era passenger liner, the SS Nakhimov. Absolutely nothing could go wrong. Nothing bad ever happens in the Great People's Union, and hey, it's not like the ship could sink for a 3rd time. The SS Nakhimov actually has quite the interesting origin story. As with quite a few large ships of the post-war USSR and onwards, she was not actually built in the Soviet Union, but was actually built in Germany. See, after the First World War, the Germans found themselves quite literally up shit creek when it came to the nautical department. Before the war, the German steamers were world-renowned. What you might not know is that barely a few weeks after the Titanic sailed and, plopped itself on the bottom of the ocean, the Germans actually won up to the British steamers by making an even bigger ship, the SS Imperator. Granted, it wasn't the most stable, and it was called the Limperator by the crew and the passengers because it, rolled around like a big cylinder, But they still did it. The Germans also built 2 other major ships of the kind and other force-funneled superliners such as Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. The great race for ocean liner dominance was really at the time between Britain and Germany, with the United States lagging very far behind and France kind of not even bothering and just sort of building luxurious ships. But of course, in 1914 the whole war thing kind of got in the way. It wasn't exactly cognizant to good health to go gallivanting across the Atlantic in an ocean liner, as the RMS Lusitania shortly found out. It was even worse if you were in a German liner, because just to get out of the North Sea you had to run the gauntlet of the world's largest navy. So, the 3 big German ships, the Imperator, Vaterland and Bismarck, all built in Hamburg, sort of just bobbed about and didn't do too much during the war. After the defeat of the German army, and yes, it was defeated, the 3 big ships were spread amongst the victors, with the Imperator being given to the Cunard Line to replace RMS Lusitania as RMS Berengaria, the Vaterland went to the United States and became the SS Leviathan, and the last ship, being completed as the RMS Majestic, given to the White Star Line to replace the sister ship of the Titanic, the HMHS Britannic, that went down during the war. That was the case across the entire German merchant fleet, to be honest, in particular the ocean liners. The number of major ships sunk by the U-boats along with the scuttling of German warships made the Allies genuinely quite vengeful. They quickly seized as many ships as possible and forbid, according to the Treaty of Versailles, the construction of new major warships. Even the Emden, the first cruiser built after the war, was so woefully outdated it's not even funny. It did look nice though. The civilian shipyards though did have a bit of an opportunity here, and they sought out contracts to make ships desperately to get the economy working during the Weimar years. One of those was the shipyard of Bremer Vulkan, who received in the early 1920s the contract to build a new German liner from Norddeutsche Lloyd, or North German Lloyd. The new ship wasn't going to be the biggest, it wasn't going to be the fastest or the most magnificent, but she would be rather impressive all the same. Measuring up to 174 metres long, 21 metres at the beam and travelling along at an economical 16 knots, the SS Berlin was launched on the 25th of March 1925 from Yard 614, and it was commissioned that September. The SS Berlin would be assigned to the Bremen, Southampton, Cherbourg, New York City route, kind of like the Titanic route with an extra stop, and would serve this route quite successfully from 1925 to 1939, and it was a relatively uneventful career, with one notable exception. In 1928, the Berlin came to the rescue of the passengers of the Vestris, a steamer that had gone down off the coast of Virginia en route from Barbados. 113 would die in the sinking, but 60 passengers and 155 crew would survive with the help of the Berlin. In 1939, the Berlin was chartered by the Nazis for one of those very fake Strength Through Joy vacation cruises as a reward for hard workers. This was nominally part of the whole Volksgemeinschaft thing, and it was pure propaganda, to show off that if you worked hard and became a good little Nazi, you would get rewarded. In reality, these kind of cruises didn't happen very often, and when they did, they were highly choreographed, as everything was within the Nazi state. After the war started, the Berlin was requisitioned by the Nazi government as a hospital ship, in German, a Lazarettschiff. The ship would mostly be used for accommodation and transport for military personnel through the war though. Given that the fact the war was not exactly nautically successful for the Germans after 1941 outside of submarines, that meant that the ship pretty much had an uneventful war, right up until 1945 when the Red Army started tearing its way through East Prussia. The ship would then be assigned to Operation Hannibal, which was the mass transport of civilians and soldiers from the eastern Baltic to the west. But while forming up in a convoy on the 31st of January, the ship hit a mine near Swinemünde and was put under tow, and then it hit another mine. The ship would then be beached and all of its equipment would be stripped off just before midnight in shallow waters with only one fatality and abandoned, where the Soviets would find her sometime later. In a funny twist of fate, the Berlin, yes, the ship that was sitting in shallow water rusting, was awarded to the Soviet Union as a war reparation, and the industrious little Baltic fleet got to work in 1946 sealing up the ship. In 1947 the ship was raised and then promptly exploded again, for reasons, sinking, for a second time. This trapped a diver underneath the ship, but interestingly the massively chunky copper helmet the Soviet was wearing kind of saved his life because it sort of got pinned and he couldn't really move, but it held him in place and his comrades were able to dive down and dig a big hole under the ship to get him out. On the second attempt, the raising of the Berlin was successful, and she was sent for repairs. The Soviets decided to rename their new toy, albeit with some plugged holes, the Admiral Nakhimov, after an old 19th century Russian naval commander who played a role in the Russian Navy getting absolutely slapped around during the Crimean War. She entered service in 1957, and in 1962 she was used to transport soldiers to Cuba during the missile crisis. I just want to say that voyage would have been horrible, because the ship was built to the North Sea and they sent it to the tropics. The ship would then become very famous as a Soviet passenger ship for several years, particularly in the Black Sea, travelling from Odessa to Batumi and back on 6-day round cruises, taking advantage of the cruising season for the well-off but totally equal to the rural farmers, city-living Soviet citizens. And so, this is where we find ourselves on the evening of the 31st of April 1986, when the now 60-plus-year-old Admiral Nakhimov, with 888 passengers and 346 crew, set off from Novorossiysk, most of the passengers on board being Ukrainians, Moldovans and Russians. The captain of the ship was Vadim Markov, and the first mate was Alexander Chudnovsky. Yes, his name was Chud. A few minutes after clearing the docks and with a pilot at the helm of the ship, it came into contact with the 18,000-ton Japanese-built but Russian-bought bulk-carrying cargo ship, the Pyotr Vasev, and somebody on the bridge noticed that they were on a bit of a collision course. So having a slight concern that his ship may not survive a fourth giant hole in it, the captain radioed off to the Vasev and said, "Hey, can we not smack into each other?" The Vasev was pretty amenable to not role-playing a battering ram, and it responded back with, "Don't worry, we will pass clear of each other, and we will take care of everything." Now for those who are nautically inclined, I know you just cringed because the rules of the ocean exist for a reason, and the very sorry, "Don't worry about it, it'll be fine," wasn't entirely the best thing to hear over the radio. But satisfied everything was going to be fine, Captain Vadim Markov retired to his cabin and left Officer Chud in command, who continued to potter along. Meanwhile, the Vasev just didn't bother changing course, because its captain quite literally went, "Meh, we won't hit it." Officer Chud radioed a few times asking where they were, and if they could move, but would decide to just change his course, and according to a couple of sources, didn't bother telling the Vasev he did it. But don't worry, because apparently the Vasev just ignored the Nakhimov anyway during the radio contact, so if they'd have listened, who knows? At 11:10 PM, Chudnovsky screamed across the radio to the Vasev to go full astern her engines, and the Nakhimov turned to port after they spotted each other, but it was completely useless at this point. 2 minutes later, the Vasev hit the Nakhimov barely 8 nautical miles from Novorossiysk, and absolute horror ensued. Now the passengers were mostly in bed, but those on deck could do nothing but watch the immense freighter tear right into the side of the ship, and leave an 84-metre square hole in the side between the engines and the boilers. Immediately the Nakhimov's lights went out, leaving hundreds trapped below, in a maze of corridors as the ship rolled over. The lack of power meant that the watertight doors didn't actually close. Not that it would have necessarily saved the ship, but it could have bought them time. There was absolutely no time to launch the lifeboats, but even then it would have been impossible, as in true Soviet fashion, the lifeboat davits didn't work because they were so rusted, and being given the landlord special of being painted over non-stop so they looked good, but were so clogged that they were stuck in place. Rafts were thrown overboard, and people dived into the water, holding onto whatever they could, but the ship would sink in only 7 minutes, with rescue teams arriving in just 10 minutes as the ship was, next to the harbour. The Vasev was mostly undamaged and did actually stop to render some assistance. The passengers and the crew had little time to escape. Of the 1,234 aboard, 423 drowned. The Black Sea Shipping Company sent out their rescue ship, the SS-21, and it arrived 10 hours later. The divers of the Black Sea Fleet also got involved in the rescue attempt. The old ship upturned and a maze of corridors, as I said, was a nightmare for the divers, as well as the passengers, and 2 of the rescues were actually killed trying to navigate the ship, where they thought people were still trapped alive in air pockets. In all, this disaster was absolutely horrific, but it begs the question, how did the ship sink this fast? Well, the answer was it was the Soviet Union. So how did this large ship get sunk? It's a serious question that I'm posing. I mean, it likely had something to do with the giant bloody hole caused by the giant freighter smacking into it, but there's a bit more to it. The Nakhimov was built to an extremely high standard by the Germans in 1925, half a century earlier, but there were some changes made that caused a few complications to the ship's ability to keep the wet stuff out. First things first, the ventilation was absolutely god-awful, as I mentioned briefly when I went to Cuba. I mean, shockingly, it was god-awful. It was built for the North Atlantic, and the Soviets were trying to use it as a cruise ship near the Black Sea, so, it got a bit hot. The lack of ventilation, which nobody tried to fix over the 40 or so years, led the Soviets to do one thing. Well, it led to them to have everybody make the decision to leave their portholes open. Pretty much every single porthole on the entire ship. That alone may not seem too dangerous, but don't worry, it'll get a lot worse. See, to make better use of the ship, the Soviets decided in the biggest of brain moments just to remove some of the bulkheads. You know, things that, had they been there, would have stopped the sinking or at least slowed it to a point to allow the launching of lifeboats. Well, that's if the bloody things were ever maintained, and they could be launched in the first place, but, you know, whatever. But the funniest part of all of this, in terms of just Soviet incompetence, is that even if the bulkheads were there, and the lifeboats had time to be launched, they couldn't actually be launched, not because of the clogging, but because they could only be launched with electric winches, which didn't work when the engines were turned off. Look, I'm not going to say it's the worst kind of nautical disaster through incompetence. I mean, there's that one Greek line from the 60s that was pretty horrific. But for the love of God, don't go on Aeroflot and don't get on a Russian-maintained ocean liner from half a century ago and expect the safety features to work. If the murder of the safety features were not enough to aggravate you, it's about to get worse, because what came after was violently Soviet. First things first, we need to understand the context of exactly when this happened. I alluded to it at the start, but this was just a few months after the Chernobyl nuclear reactor number 4 detonated, and the Soviet government was not exactly pleased with another embarrassment. So they didn't even allow reporting that the ship had sunk for 48 hours, and even then, the people who survived were only permitted to send a simple signal that they were in fact alive and safe. And that was it. In terms of foreign and domestic news, nobody really paid attention to what had occurred because, let's be honest, Chernobyl was a bit bigger of an issue, and the Soviet government was happy to rely on the news media being unable or unwilling to report on more than one bad thing at a time. The Soviet government formed a commission of inquiry to investigate what had actually happened, and as an upside to the situation, they didn't need to actually find a scapegoat, as there were a couple already neatly there. Both the captain of the Nakhimov and the Varyag were deemed to have violated international safety rules. Despite multiple orders to let the Nakhimov pass, the captain of the Varyag, Tkachenko, refused to slow his ship down, and only actually reported the incident 40 minutes after it happened. Now remember, the ship sank in 7 minutes. Captain Markov was in trouble, because he was not on the bridge, which he should have been because his ship was going out of port. And, you know, it was the whole, yeah, it'll be fine, it's a ship coming towards us, it'll be fine, let them deal with it. The inquiry into the sinking took place in Odessa during March 1987, and both of the captains were sent to prison for 15 years each, but released in early autumn, which is fall for the Yanks, because, you know, leaf fall down, in 1992. The wildest part of the story so far, in my opinion, is that after his minimum prison sentence, Markov, you know, the captain of the ocean liner who went, meh, it'll be fine, and then went to bed, became a mentor for captains in the Black Sea Shipping Company. It died in Odessa in 2007. Meanwhile, the captain of the Varyag, Tkachenko, went abroad, and somehow died in a yacht crash near Canada. Nobody really knows what happened, but I mean, it might have been a similar cause of death to certain members of the Russian government, or he could have just not paid attention and crashed into something. There was a precedent there, so who knows. The Nakhimov, meanwhile, lies on the bottom, not too far from Novorossiysk, and now on the bottom of the Black Sea, it is joined by, well, a significant portion of the Russian Black Sea fleet. It's not lonely anymore. Now, I'm actually somewhat running out of ideas. Call it a brain fade for the meantime, and not the fact that I accidentally deleted my list of videos to make when I changed PCs. Please don't look into that, I definitely didn't do that. So comment below your ideas for videos, and I'll take some on board. I'm considering the aircraft hijacking in an attempt to fly to Finland from some Siberian farmer's saga, but let me know what you think. Any parts of history, be it ancient Egypt, Rome, Greece, all the way through the medieval and modern period. Give me your ideas below. The Soviet Navy is one of the most interesting naval forces in the world, and it really always has been. There is a clear evolution between Tsarist Navy to Red Navy to modern Russian Navy, and throughout history you have a case of either pure competency and brilliance, such as Russo-Japanese and the crew of the ship we're going to be talking about today, or you have this. The light, well technically heavy cruiser, but we'll get to that, Krasny Kavkaz, is a great example of this kind of incompetent insanity born from desperation to appear big on the world stage, and while not entirely a story like that of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, K-19, or any of the other ones we looked at, it is rather quite interesting in how the Soviet Union threw a bunch of pig iron onto a floating hull and tried to pass it off as brilliance. What is even more surprising is somehow the crew managed to channel voodoo from Rasputin to make it work. But how do you get to this point? Well, let's find out.
Now, once the Soviet Union was established, the innocent people were terrorized for owning a particularly nice sock and the white Russians were massacred. The state of the Red military was somewhere between crap and inept, and quite a lot of work was needed to make it able to stand for longer than 5 minutes against the great enemies of the Soviet Union of equals. It's not an empire. It was an empire. For those who say it wasn't an empire, it absolutely was. The Navy, in particular, coming off the back of being treated worse than a weeaboo's anime body pillow in 1905 against Japan, and then having some marginal success but really just a fair bit of sadness and nothing in World War I, was in an even worse state. To the Russian Empire's credit, it had managed to get its proverbial shit together following the Russo-Japanese War, and had churned out a pretty decent fleet. Nothing particularly amazing, mind you, but the new dreadnoughts of which, although they look a bit how-do-you-do, were actually quite good, all things considered, and above all, the Tsar's navy had managed to churn out some pretty damn good cruisers and destroyers. The Ottomans were easily now matched in the Black Sea by these new ships, and the Germans were in the position that on the one side they had the British looking menacingly, and on the other side they had a particularly decent sized navy that could quite easily work towards the kind of warfare known as the jeu ne colle, or the small war at sea. Now you may ask, jeu ne colle, that sounds French, not Russian. Well, yes it is. It's the kind of warfare at sea invented by the French, who had spent the best part of 100 years from 1700 to 1800 being in a particularly violent relationship with the Royal Navy. The idea was, and this is a bit of a simplification, that a lot of cheap boats could hold off and defeat the enemy with a smaller number of big boats. So, sort of swarm tactics. There is an extent that it does work. See what Ukraine's doing in the Black Sea at the moment with drones. You can use smaller ships to defeat bigger ships. Lots of smaller ships, fewer bigger ships. It works out. And the Italians did this with great effect during the First World War, using mass boats to sink an Austro-Hungarian dreadnought. But let's be honest, you don't willingly engage in this kind of warfare if you can afford ships, and if you have ships. The simple fact was, France at the time couldn't afford ships anywhere near on the scale the British could, and Russia, in 1914, after the aforementioned anime body pillow treatment by the IJN, could not exactly afford a battle fleet to go head-to-head with Kaiser Willie's pet navy. So what does this have to do with a Soviet cruiser from 1932? Yeah, I'm getting there, hang on. The Soviet Navy, technically founded in 1918 but only given actual time to breathe and organise itself following the Civil War in the early 1920s, was in a state somewhere akin to a university student's liver during orientation week. It had lost most of its surface warships during the war to either joining the White cause, getting sunk, or in general just falling apart, because let's be honest, with the state of the Russian Empire in 1917, and later the Soviet Union, maintenance wasn't exactly a known word, and, well, understandably so. This doesn't excuse them for forgetting what maintenance is after the war and into the 1990s and present day, but for this period, we'll give them a bit of a pass. The Soviets, rightly having the brain power to understand that they can't dick measure against the Western naval powers, probably time to point out that Lenin was in charge, not Stalin, yet, decided to go around and look at the different partially completed hulls sitting on the slipways around the Soviet Union. Some particularly enterprising fellows made their way into the Ukrainian SSR to the Mykolaiv shipyards, and noticed that there was a 60% completed hull floating around the harbour called Admiral Nakhimov. Initially it was laid down in 1913 and launched 3 years later. The ship was intended to be completed as one of the new light cruisers that I mentioned at the start of the video, for the renewed Imperial Russian Navy after Tsushima. Given that the Soviet industry wasn't the best, this practically new, albeit quite rusty hulk bobbing around the harbour covered in enough weeds to double as a set for Jurassic Park was a godsend and would allow the Soviets to start reconstituting the Black Sea Fleet, which was in a really bad state following all the war, and if it came to it, it would have genuinely been in a lot of trouble had the Turks and Soviets ended up at each other's throats, which, let's be honest, there's a bit of historical precedence there. And it's quite sad when you realise it, because the Soviets, well, the Russians before the Soviets, had a fleet that could easily wipe the Turkish fleet out, or the Ottoman fleet, later Turkish fleet. Then the Civil War happened, and then, well, the Soviets inherited pretty much nothing. As an interesting anecdote, the cruiser, if you can call it that given its state of completion at the time, had already been owned by the Russian Empire, then it was captured by the German Empire, then it was handed over to the Triple Entente, and then the White Russians, and then finally the Soviets got it. But anyway, moving on. It is now 1927, Lenin has died, Stalin is now the god emperor of the Soviet Union, and the Admiral Lazarev and his sister ship Admiral Nakhimov, also bobbing in the harbour, have been selected for completion. The slight issue with, though, is the size of the ships. Although they are both cruisers, the difference between a cruiser from 1913 and 1927 are quite remarkable. For comparison's sake, a light cruiser built at the same time in the United Kingdom, the HMS, later HMNZS, Leander, was 169.1 metres, or 554 feet long. It was armed with 8 6-inch turreted guns, and it was around 9,700 tons at full load, and it could cruise at 32.5 knots, and it had a tremendous cruising range. Our hero, meanwhile, as designed, was 163.2 metres or 535 feet long, but only 7,600 tons, and armed with 15 single-mount 5.1-inch guns with a speed of around 29 knots. While the difference between 5.1 and 6 inches doesn't sound like much, it is, I'm sorry to say. In gun caliber, get your mind out of the gutter. Not to mention the advantage of turreted guns under direct fire control rather than the single guns. And although the size doesn't sound tremendously different in length, 163 metres versus 169 metres, that weight is huge. Had Leander come into contact with a ship like this during the Second World War, or just after its completion, both of their completions, Leander would have absolutely crippled her old relative from before the First World War. This isn't me trying to insult the ship, it's just pointing out the limitations at the time. An extra 5 metres along with an increase in tonnage and just advances in design really do make a difference. The Soviets were well aware of the limitations of these older ships' hulls as well, and after completing the first hull of Chernobyl to the original design, it was decided in an attempt to modernise, something radical would be done with the second hull, now known as Krasny Kavkaz, the Red Caucasus. Tangent here, for those who don't know, the difference between a light and a heavy cruiser is purely down to gun caliber, and it is really outlined in the naval treaties following the First World War. Prior to the war, you have all manner of cruisers, scout cruisers with tiny quick-firing guns, light cruisers with around 5 to 6 inch guns, and then armoured cruisers, usually with 4 big guns and some smaller ones. And of course, the king of the cruiser, the battlecruiser, with all big guns. It is all a bit complicated, but they all had perceived roles. Jutland and Doggerbank really showed just how out of place the armoured cruiser was in the modern world, and it would die off very quickly following the war, with the only remaining armoured cruiser in the world being the Greek museum ship Georgios Averov. Scout cruisers were also becoming so outmatched by even destroyers that they were now deemed to be, well, essentially pointless. The light cruiser survived as a good middle ground, but what if you needed something slightly bigger, especially now that battleships were being limited? 6-inch guns were great, but they just didn't cover all the bases. Again, get your mind out of the gutter, not like that. Sometimes a navy just needs a bit more, and so the heavy cruiser was born. For the sake of simplicity, like I said, the only real difference between a heavy and a light cruiser is the gun caliber. Armour does not come into this at all. Take a look at the French heavy cruisers from the interwar period. Those things had basically paper for armour. And the newish Soviet cruiser Chernobyl with 5.1-inch guns was very weak, when it comes to being a light cruiser that is, compared to our contemporaries in 1927, let alone the ships that were being planned. The Soviets therefore had this idea that they could fit twin 8-inch guns to the hull, that was fitting out, 8 of them in fact, which off the bat was just an insane idea because they, for one, just wouldn't fit, and two, if you did put these guns on it, it is questionable whether the hull could handle the weight, let alone the recoil. So back to the drawing board, and the Soviets were really quite intent on putting a big gun on the hull. With orders from high up to make a strong cruiser, the design team really had no choice. It was either make a big strong heavy cruiser or, Stalin. Granted, he wasn't purging everyone yet with the liberal application of brass to the upper skull, he was just implementing policies to starve everyone north of Mykolaiv shipyard to death. Either way, it is the Soviet Union, you do as you're told. Somebody took a look around though and noticed the Soviet Union had this big gun that just might fit in the form of the BL 7.1-inch Mark VI naval gun. A 7.1-inch gun would satisfy the need for the ship to be upgunned and far more capable than Chernobyl with her 5.1-inch guns. Slight issue though, the ship could only fit 4 instead of the 15 smaller guns, again due to size limitations, and the weight was now pushed up to 9,000 tons on a full load, almost equaling the much larger Leander-class cruisers I had mentioned before. So you have a smaller hull that you're just stuffing more things into. This can only go well. Krasny Kavkaz would therefore be finished as the powerfully armed 7.1-inch armed cruiser, which by definition could be considered a heavy cruiser-ish on the world stage. Her superstructure and funnels were redesigned to form a sleek and powerful looking vessel that signalled the return of the Great Russian fleet to the world stage. At least that's what the propaganda said, and the outside said. The reality was not entirely the same. The Krasny Kavkaz, while yes it was armed with 7.1-inch guns, it only had 4 in single turret mounts, and this was in 1932. For comparison's sake, the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned the cruiser Takao in 1932 armed with 10 8-inch guns. The United States at the round time was introducing the Northampton class with 9 8-inch guns. The British, Italian, and French fleets were also commissioning ships with at least 8 8-inch guns, which doesn't bode well for any kind of plausible engagement the ship might find itself in with a foreign power, save for maybe Turkey, which, let's be honest, precedents aside, wasn't exactly going to get involved in a conflict during the interwar period. It had its own internal issues. In an attempt to flaunt the power of the Krasny Kavkaz, a big emphasis has been made upon how fast the shell velocity was from her guns, giving her the incredible range of 38.5 kilometers or 23.9 miles. Now this is a really impressive range, especially when you compare it to the equivalent British 7.5-inch guns in the Hawking-class cruiser. It is less impressive when you consider the ability to hit anything at this range is the equivalent of a near-Confederate succeeding in their attempt to speak to a woman. That isn't a direct relation. While yes, it is true these guns technically outranged everything else comparable in size, Soviet fire control at the time was not exactly the best or remotely on par with Western systems, and further to that the guns weren't exactly the most stable, nor were the mounts the best. Although they aren't as bad as the mounts on the Kirov class cruisers, but that's another thing entirely, and I'll get to that at a later date. Further to that, the gun itself could only fire a few dozen rounds before the barrel needed to be replaced. Yeah, that's right, a few dozen rounds, which is just astronomically bad. Turns out stuffing the gun with cordite to make the shell go far doesn't actually make your gun better. For comparison's sake, that British 7.5-inch gun I mentioned, yeah, its average life expectancy for a barrel was 650 full charges, which you know is quite a bit more. Not to mention the speed was relatively slow. Now, 29 knots isn't bad by any means, but it really isn't great when you compare it to the low to mid-30s that other cruisers at the time were pulling off. Therefore, in their attempt to make a powerfully armed cruiser, in reality the Soviets produced the nicest looking turd to ever sail in the Soviet Navy, entering service on the 25th of January 1932. Initially, the ship would take part in cruises around the Black Sea, Greece, Turkey, and Italy, showing the flag and such, and in this role she was seemingly quite effective. At the time, it is worth mentioning the USSR and Fascist Italy were quite close, particularly when it came to naval development, and many of the ships the USSR would field during and after World War II had their roots in Italy, such as the Kirovs that I mentioned before, destroyers too, like the Tashkent. Krasny Kavkaz would have a relatively quiet career largely due to geography and her base in the Black Sea, meaning that she took no part in the early stages of World War II, in which the Soviet Union allied with Nazi Germany, invaded Poland, and later alone invaded Finland. However, come June 22, 1941, the ship would be engaged on almost the very first day of Operation Barbarossa during the bombarding of Sevastopol by the Luftwaffe. The naval war in the Black Sea honestly warrants its own video, but the situation was thus that the Soviets held a numerical advantage in firepower over the Axis powers, able to call on the battleship Parishkaya Komuna, Paris Commune, 2 modern cruisers, 4 older ones that had varying levels of rebuild, including Krasny Kavkaz and Shabana Ukraina, 14 modern destroyers, and then a smattering of older ships. The Axis, meanwhile, had 4 destroyers of varying use and some smaller ships. The big equalizer, though, was that during the initial stages of the war, the Axis had total dominance over the skies. With the rapid Axis advance into the Ukrainian USSR, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet would therefore find itself playing the role of convoy escort, resupply, and gunfire support. There would be no major fleet engagements, and this was helped by both the Montreux Convention, but also the fact that the Italian Navy was busy bit now being slapped around by Cunningham and HMS Warspite with her never-ending plot armour. On the 11th of September 1941, the Krasny Kavkaz fired her guns in anger for the first time on German forces approaching Odessa, and she would further have the task of ferrying naval infantry into Odessa and the surrounding regions to assist with the defence of the city, making multiple runs between Sevastopol and Odessa and acting as a floating fire support battery. A standout moment of the ship's wartime service was her participation in the Kerch-Feodosia landing operation on the 28th of December 1941. After taking aboard around 1900 paratroopers supporting light artillery and vehicles, the ship forced a landing whilst under fire in Feodosia Bay. The cruiser would take 13 hits from German coastal batteries, leaving gaping holes in the vessel that were plugged with whatever could be found. According to Soviet records, a German shell penetrated the armour of the cruiser and exploded in the second turret amongst the ammunition, and whilst the flames engulfed the powder bags and very nearly spread to the ammunition store, which would have certainly destroyed the ship, a sailor named Vasily Pokutkin regained his composure following a hit, and unable to in any way to throw the flaming bags overboard or flood where he was standing, he threw his body onto the flames to snuff them out, and suffered horrific burns to his body because of this. The next day, the ship was attacked 25 times by aircraft. On the 4th of January, the ship would again return landing more troops but would come under attack by Stukas, being hit with her stern thrown out of the water and her right propeller thrown off, and the left propeller shaft becoming gravely damaged. The ship would take on 2,000 tons of water and settle deeply into the ocean, keeping in mind she was already massively overweight, and by some miracle the ship made it back to port on the 3rd of April 1942, and due to this action she would be awarded the Guards title. As the Soviet lines advanced, the role of the Black Sea Fleet became less and less important, and the Krasny Kavkaz would find herself relegated to far less risky operations. By this time, the ship had engaged in at least 30 combat operations, including 9 fire support missions, 2 mine clearance operations, and the continuous transport of soldiers. She had travelled 14,000 miles and transported around 25,000 soldiers, and assisted in evacuation. Surviving the war, the Krasny Kavkaz would be relegated to the role of a training ship before being retired and expended in a test of the first Soviet anti-ship missile, the SSN-1, in 1956. The Krasny Kavkaz represents in many ways the very best and the very worst of the Soviet Navy. On the one hand, you can truly see what can and did happen with Soviet vessels when they had competent commanders and crews. The ship undoubtedly paid for herself and punched so far above her weight it's not even funny during the war years. And yes, this is helped a fair bit by the fact she didn't have to engage in surface warfare with any contemporaries, of which she 100% would have lost. On the other hand, the Krasny Kavkaz is a clear example of a solid idea, that being the rebuilding and expanding of the Russian, now Soviet fleet by making use of whatever you have available, and then ruining it by attempting to make mega thing bigger. In many ways, it is not too dissimilar to the modern Kirov-class cruisers, sometimes called a battlecruiser by the wrong people. In a rush to make the biggest and greatest thing, the Soviets put to sea a colossal behemoth that has to partially sink itself to fire its main weaponry because it was designed to be used in a submarine. Smakalka does not mean good. At the end of the day, the Krasny Kavkaz is lucky, very lucky, that it never had to face another surface ship in combat. But it also has a pretty damn brilliant track record. And although the hull was small, the engines were old and they were pretty slow, the guns were horrific, the accommodation for the crew as with all Soviet ships was quite dated and not great. And, you know, it's not exactly great being on a ship being run by a commissar. I kind of have a soft spot for this one.